And what we are going to do now is we are going to play about 5 to 7 seconds of intermission music because, folks, what we're doing here is we have taped this earlier in the day on Wednesday, and then we're going to break and we're going to watch the Viceland Dark Side of the Ring episode tonight on the Montreal Screwjob, and then reconvene, Brian and I, and record the rest of this program. See, I've exposed the business. I've exposed our business here, and if you watch this Montreal Screwjob episode, it will expose more of the business, if that's even possible.
Wow, in one calendar day, you exposed the business on audio, on TV.
But you'll never miss us, folks. We're only going to be gone for a few seconds, and we'll be back, and I'll probably sound hoarser because I got to scream at the people painting my fence later today, and we'll be back and talk about the Dark Side of the Ring.
Man, that didn't even seem like 9 hours.
Well, you're going to be able to tell probably because my voice is 9 hours older. But okay, we're back, folks. And we have watched the program, and I'm going to try to get all the details in that they didn't have time for. And here's the thing. It was a 45-minute television show. It couldn't be covered like the Kennedy assassination. You can't do the Warren Commission report in 45 minutes. So everybody's going to go, all the wrestling fans are going to go, but there's so many details they left out and the blah, blah, blah. But for, once again, this is for mainstream consumption. You know, they hit the high points, but obviously I have some splaining to do. And actually, there's more details than were revealed in the program, and that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the show here. And we could do 3 hours if I had the voice. But basically, I don't think a lot of people understand how the creative team worked with Vince McMahon. During 1996, it was me and Bruce. Right? I've told those stories. We used to play with his dog at his house and wait for Vince to tell us what to do. But we were still booking wrestling. And then in February 97, two things happened, really in the same week, that both impacted this match. One was Shawn Michaels losing his smile, right? Remember that? Where he came out on Raw and gave the title away, said, "I've lost my smile," career-ending knee injury, right?
Yes.
We had been told by Vince on the phone, well, Shawn has a career-ending knee injury. He had been told on the phone by Shawn, and we were told at a writing session the next day or whatever. And Bret Hart had taken off in 96. He had put Shawn over for the belt, and he'd taken a year off. He was going to do the Lonesome Dove TV show, which he did. And more importantly, he was going to watch Shawn Michaels self-destruct as WWF champion, which he was. Not physically, but mentally, whether it be the pills or whether it be that they've admitted, or whether it be fucking juvenile behavior, or then he's lost his smile, career-ending injury, which lasted a couple months, and then he came back, right? And blah, blah, blah.
I was even thinking about business-wise. It was self-destruct in terms of the house shows went down,
well,
the ratings went down, yeah.
And he wasn't as bad as Diesel, Shawn, at the box office, but, you know, who was? Nobody. Well. But at the same time, in February 97, and I looked this up because I wanted to make sure I was in the right place. And you know, I got all my books here. I'm looking in my book. It was the Raw on February 26th, because that was the Raw where they were some in Germany and some in the studio. You remember this, right? The all-time worst rated Raw.
Yes, yes.
And the way that everybody had sold Vince on this was, it'll show the global reach of the WWF, that we're in the studio in Stamford with Stone Cold Steve Austin, but the tour's in Germany, and we're seeing this European title match with Davey Boy and Owen. And, you know, it's all live, and it's just global, right? What it was the shits. Because when there's Bischoff and WCW on the other channel blowing everything up with pyro and all the big stars and a major arena all lit up, Germany turned out to be a production nightmare. It was dark as shit. It looked like an old outlaw, you know, house show match. But then it was a disjointed television program because we're in the studio in Stamford where Stone Cold's doing a promo, but then somebody's on the phone with Vince and you see a headshot, and it was just a lousy TV show. And it obviously wasn't my idea to go do goddamn Raw from Berlin, right? So no apologies, you know, no offense to the fucking Berliners. So the next day, that's when Vince calls the meeting, and he's mad at everybody, regardless whether they had anything to do with it or not. And he brings in the one guy who didn't have anything to do with it, Vince Russo. And that's how Russo got on the creative team, because he's got all these ideas, pal, and he's writing the stuff in the magazine. So anyway, that's how we got saddled with Vince Russo. So 1997 became a year of misery for me, because not only were we trying to be, and it was Bruce and me and Russo, and most of the time now we're going to the office, but we go every Wednesday to Vince's house to write. And that's back still when it was before the monthly pay-per-views. So we were, we had several weeks to come up with shit, and then you do the tapings in a lump. But whereas Bruce and I got along fine, because like I said, at least we were still doing wrestling, it quickly became that Russo did not understand how this shit worked, didn't want to know, didn't give a fuck about finding out, wanted to write the whole thing like Jerry Springer and expose everything and make everything, goddamn, basically what he did the rest of his career. And it got to the point where I couldn't fucking take it anymore, right? Meanwhile, Shawn and Bret are getting worse, because now Bret has come back. Shawn's career-ending knee injury didn't last that long. He's back. They're going to wrestle at King of the Ring or SummerSlam, whenever the first one was planned. Then they get in the fight in Hartford, where Bret jerked him around and pulled his hair out. Unsafe working.
Can I stop you right there, Jim? In the documentary that I was just on Viceland, that I'm already forgetting the name of, the Dark Side of the Ring, excuse me.
Yes.
In Dark Side of the Ring, when they showed the clump of hair being put on the table, was that an accurate representation of the size of the clump of hair?
The real one was a little bit bigger. Just so you know. But anyway, at the same time as I had other duties, I was announcing. I had transitioned from on-camera managing in 96 to announcing in 97. We did the syndication show, Superstars, with JR. And I also agented at the TVs. All that stuff was fine, but having to go to Vince McMahon's house and try to write with this guy when already, when you're on the creative team for Vince, it's a lot of what ifs, because you don't just book the wrestling that you would book if it was you. Vince tells you the main event of the pay-per-view. Vince tells you the programs between the top stars. Vince tells you the main event of Raw or the big stuff. And then you've got to pitch, well, okay, how do Brian and Jim get to that pay-per-view? Does Brian come out and fuck Jim on TV out of something? Does then Jim come out and cut a promo and run the 605 Superpodcast down the next week on what if they did this? What if they did that? Right? So that's what you would do. And when Vince liked stuff, he'd say, okay. And sooner or later, you'd get a program out of it. So now when it's me and Russo constantly sniping at each other, it's just torture. And also, then we have to worry about a champion and or a goddamn top star opposing him, whether it's Bret or Shawn. Shawn is going to fucking crack up, or Shawn's going to do this or do that or whatever the fuck. So then, on top of that, Vince has made the deal with Bret to get him back, to not take the big money deal from WCW, to take less money from WWF over a longer period of time. And then he says he wants to go back on it, and he tells Bret, no, wait, see if you can still get the deal from Bischoff. Right. And we're hearing this, and I'm going out of my mind, right? Because all of this is so stressful, and it's so much more drama and bullshit than it needs to be. So anyway, by the time that October gets around and he's planning for this, I'm like, Vince, shouldn't you have taken the belt off Bret? We're going to do it at the Survivor Series. You'll drop it to Shawn. You think? Oh, yeah. October was also the Bad Blood pay-per-view, where Brian Pillman had died. And we've told that story before. But that was also the time where, Shawn Michaels had to get out of the program with The Undertaker, right? So we fucking got that done with the introduction of Kane. And that was my what ifs. That was one of my favorite what ifs. I had said, what if, we had the cage like in Memphis where it's around the ringside? And what if, because nobody came through the ring in those days, I said, what if Kane debuts by jerking the door off like Kevin Sullivan did with Doug Furness in Knoxville Christmas night of 88 or whatever the fuck, right? And it came off. So I was getting pretty good at Vince's what ifs. But anyway, if you want to go back and relive all of the details of the Shawn and Bret fiasco leading up to Survivor Series, go back and read the Observers, because Dave had everything. It's all legitimate. He was talking to everybody. Everything that he wrote is correct in the issues the weeks after the fact, when, he reported all that stuff. So if you want all the details, but suffice it to say that the week before, and as a matter of fact, hold on, let me get my book out. It was November 5th, I believe. I'm turning to the page. You hear me turning to the page.
Those sound like actual pages.
It was Wednesday, November 5th. It's the Wednesday before Survivor Series. For the last previous few weeks, it's been just me and Russo with Vince. So not even a buffer of Bruce, just me and the other guy, right? And I dread going to these days. And this day especially, because it's the phone calls from Bret, the phone calls from Shawn, and trying to get a finish. Friday night is a house show in Toronto. Bret can't drop it there if we change the match or change the card because it's in Canada. He don't want to lose in Canada. What about Detroit on Saturday night? Well, he don't want to lose the night before Survivor Series because they've advertised a world title match. He don't want to disappoint the fans. Shawn is, at this point, will probably do whatever the fuck because he's supposed to win, right? But then Bret comes up with the idea, what about if he just, on Raw the next night, or they do a big schmoz at Survivor Series, and then on Raw the next night, he just hands the belt over and gives a farewell speech. And I'm, what? Oh, God. And every time that Vince goes back, McMahon, to take these phone calls, I'm sitting there left twiddling my thumbs, looking at Vince Russo and trying to make small talk. And it's driving me out of my mind. And at this point, I mentioned in the episode tonight, I'm almost 280 pounds. I'm aggravation eating. This fucking shit's killing me. The locker room, trying to write this shit with these people, trying to coexist with Russo. I'm grumpy. Everybody knows what happens when I get grumpy. As well, it should be noted that previous to this, and hold on, I have my copy right here. Our old friend Scott Teal, who has since done some great history books on New York and Nashville, at the time was doing Whatever Happened To, where he would interview the old timers, and it was a bulletin where he'd transcribe these interviews and old clippings. He had just reprinted, and it's the first time I'd ever had a chance to actually read it, the book, The Fall Guys, because I have my reprint right here, Wrestling Reprints #1, September 1997. I had just gotten it, and over the previous few weeks, I was taking it on the road with me to fucking read to keep my sanity. So Vince comes back in and says, we just can't work anything out. So I'm frustrated. And at one point I blurted out, God damn it, change the match. Book him with Shamrock. He'll drop the belt. But that was a smart aleck comment. But I was thinking back to when Bearcat Wright had not wanted to drop the title to Fred Blassie in California. And so instead of Blassie coming out comes Judo Gene LaBelle. But obviously, Bearcat Wright just gets out of the ring, walks out, quits the promotion. They never had the match. Bret would have done the same thing. Besides that, Shamrock's friends with Bret, and we'd have been asking him to shoot on national TV. So we couldn't do that. But then, as whatever the fuck, finally I said, God damn it. And I remember saying this, and they kind of clipped it a little bit, but I said, God damn it, Vince, it's your belt. Take it back. Double crossing. And that's when, so Vince says, McMahon, this is all McMahon. Russo's sitting there with the buggy whip arms and pie plate eyes, right? And Vince says, well, what should he do? Cinch up on a small package, which is the last double cross he did with Moolah and Wendy Richter in 85. And I just watched that not long ago, and God, did that look like shit. Because the referee was in on it because she didn't even really hold her down, and it was a mess, right? So I said no, because if Shawn Michaels tries to cinch up on Bret Hart, then Bret will kick out and beat the fuck out of him on national TV, right? And so then Vince says, well, then how would you do it? Well, now it's a fucking challenge, right? He never does anything that I'm suggesting, except for the Hell in a Cell thing. I got one the previous month, right? But I never get anything by. So now, because we're getting nothing done anyway, he has dared me to come up with a fucking double cross. So since he ain't going to do it anyway, and it's better than listening to Russo talk, now I'm determined to come up with a double cross that would work. So, and the one thing that I will give Russo in the episode tonight, they asked him, do you remember this conversation about the history lesson? No, because it wasn't a conversation. They would have cut me off after 2 minutes. I was thinking through this in my head. But double crosses. What do I know about double crosses? It can't be the fucking deal that I mentioned, the cinch up. It can't be the fucking change the match. It can't be Don the Lawman Slatton and tape it from the fucking balcony. A lot of double crosses in the old days, Gotch and Hackenschmidt, Strangler Lewis will do it the hard way, the easy way or the hard way. That was predicated on the guy doing the double cross, and it has to be able to legitimately beat the other guy, right? If you got a guy that can't legitimately beat the other guy, you have to have the referee in on it. Strangler Lewis and Henry DeGlane, the Battle of the Bite. It's a centerpiece in the Fall Guys that I'd just been reading. I said, all right, we got to have the referee in on it. But how it can't be a fucking 1, 2, 3. Back then, the tap out wasn't established, right? Remember, this was just the referee says, oh, you gave up, and you nod your head if you really want people to see it. Yeah. There was no tap out.
Yeah, that's right.
So I said, all right, why would Bret, who's smart to the business and a wrestling family, he would be looking for something screwy. But at the same time, he really knows that Shawn Michaels probably can't make him submit. That's why, he said he was worried about Earl counting him down, and he was worried about submission holds. Why would he get in that hold? Because that's another thing that the special did not make plain tonight. The spot was supposed to be that Shawn would get the sharpshooter on Bret, and then Bret would power out and do the babyface reversal and come up with a sharpshooter. And then the Hart Foundation would hit the ring. That's the spot he was given. That's why he let himself in it. But what I said was, figure out a way. We're in the finish. They're going home. Shawn gets a sharpshooter on Bret. Bret's going to reverse it, but the referee rings the bell. You can't tell whether Bret said, I quit or not, and get the fuck out of there. Everybody gets out of there, right? Because the whole idea of a double cross is you're doing a finish to get a finish you want and not expose the business and not let anybody know anything was out of the way. So I said, have the referee ring the bell. When Bret's shocked, Shawn scoots, gets the belt, go off the air and run. And then and then my last word was, what the fuck's he going to do? Call the newspapers? And of course, that's exactly what he would do. But after I said that, Vince then, he gives this, and this shrug, sort of like, okay, back to reality, when he wants you to stop talking about Gaga. And that's what he did. And then we went on with whatever the fuck else we did that day, right? I had come up with a double cross. And of course, he's never going to do it. So then the next day is November 6th. We were off. I was off from the office because I see here at 2:00, I went to the dentist, got my teeth cleaned. And then Friday the 7th, I believe we had a day off because we were fixing to go on the road. And while the house show was in Toronto, the creative team, TV crew, etc., was still in Stamford. We were going to travel to Montreal on Saturday the 8th. While the house show was in Detroit on the evening of Saturday the 8th, the creative team, Vince, the television production, we all have a production meeting at the hotel in Montreal. I had driven because even then with the flying, right? But Montreal is only up 87, 5 hours from New York. So I'm going to drive this fucking loop and not have to fly to a foreign country. So anyway, we all gather at the hotel on Saturday afternoon or evening for the production meeting. And they ran through the entire format, all the finishes, all the musics, everything. Get to the last match and, okay, music, match, finish, ding, ding, off air. That's what Vince said. All right. So we're leaving, and not like I wanted to prolong this, but I went up to him and I just leaned over and I said, Vince, do you have a finish for the main event? He said, yes. I said, good. That's all I need to know. And I went on back to the room. And the next day, you know, the film crew's following Bret around and all the other shit. I had other matches to deal with, which I did. I wasn't involved in any way with any setting up of any of the title match, right? And I heard that they were going to do the run-in because there's Owen and Davey standing by to do it. And basically, because I'm already finished with anything I'm responsible for, but if you leave early, they get mad. I'm sitting by the monitor, not at the gorilla position, but down the one they set up for the boys, right? And I'm going to watch the fucking match, and then as soon as it's over, I'm going to hop in the car. Well, then Vince goes out, right? And would he take Slaughter with him, I think? Anyway, I'm like, okay, that kind of adds to it. It's a little edgy because people are already wondering if they're going to get in a big fight. Shawn and Bret, the smart fans are that existed then, are wondering what's going to happen. And so I didn't think too much about it, and Shawn and Bret are having a great match. And then finally, I didn't know anything until I saw them going into that spot. And I shit myself. Because at that moment, I realized he's going to fucking do this. He's going to fucking double cross him on fucking live television, and this is my finish, right? And I'm like, fuck. Certainly to God not. And they do it. But Vince is saying, ring the bell. My finish was designed to get the fuck out of there. Nobody knows anything's wrong. Vince takes it completely the other way and calls attention to it and is forcing the issue. And as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, thought he was going to be the babyface. So I see that when the bell rings, I said, fuck, I don't know who knows that I had anything to do with this or what the fuck. I jump up, and like I said in the show, I go get in the car and I beat fucking Hebner out of there. And I was all night. I'm like, what the fuck? When I show up tomorrow, is somebody going to want to beat my ass? And that, of course, the next day is when Cactus did no show. Of course, Owen and Davey did, but that's understandable. But Cactus did. And I get there and Vince just, everything's going to be all right. We're going to have these meetings. We're going to do this. We're going to tell the talent. And Cornette, call Cactus Jack and get him to come back. I'm like, fuck. So he doesn't know this to this day until now. But when I called him and he was saying, I can't believe Vince double-crossed one of the boys, it was my fucking finish. And I'm trying to talk him back into fucking coming back to work.
Who did know? How many people did know that it was your finish?
Me and the two Vinces. That's the only people that were in the fucking room.
You ever said it to anyone else since then?
Well, I told a few people after the fact, which we'll get into.
Okay.
But at that time, I didn't know because once again, Pat Patterson, I'm sorry for my voice, folks. Pat Patterson was the one who agented the match and probably told him the spot. But I don't think Pat really knew because Vince always protected Pat and he wouldn't have wanted to put him in that position. But it wouldn't have been unusual for Vince to say, hey, Pat, at least, let's do this spot. Let's get it exciting. And give him that spot and let him relay it, right? Without telling Pat what was going to happen beforehand. I believe Bruce didn't know because he didn't need to know. But once again, until I got there the next day, I didn't know, who had told what to who. So then I get there and nobody's yelling at me. So I'm like, okay. But once again, this is my issue was twofold. Number one, I liked Bret and Shawn was a prick. And it was only out of frustration that I came up with a fantasy scenario because I was dared to by the goddamn, billionaire owner who was only a multimillionaire then. I didn't think he was actually going to do it. Secondly, inadvertently, much like finding out that my fan club president got Vince Russo into business originally, me, who always wanted to uphold kayfabe and protect the business, is responsible inadvertently for the one finish that did more to expose the business than anything else in modern fucking history. So I have lived with that guilt. And honestly, that's why I didn't want to say anything, because I'm like, what the fuck? This was just a goddamn, a what if. But he did it. And then Vince thought he was going to be the good guy. And he was going to go out there and say Bret wouldn't honor the time-honored tradition. And all the people turned on him because he came off like a heel. And they loved Bret. So that inadvertently led to Mr. McMahon, which inadvertently led to more exposing of the fucking business and all of the backstage gaga. It's Scott Teal's fault. It's Scott Teal's fault. It's his fault. But anyway, so after that, and then, within a few weeks, all the guys had settled down a bit and et cetera. But Jim Ross knew after the fact, because I told him. And I also, and we're probably going to try to talk to him, I told Dave Meltzer, because Dave was talking to everybody else and getting everything else right. That's the only way I was able to find out what the story was for the shit that I wasn't around for, was by calling Dave Meltzer. But also, I had called him when I was snooping around wanting to find out if anybody was mad at me. And since I had known Dave for 15 years, I knew that he would keep it in confidence if I explained it to him. And I did, and he has all this time. So, and then later on, Danny Davis knew about it. But I did not bandy it quite a bit. And then I got to say this, Bolin, years after the fact, Star Maker Bolin tried to claim on his show that I called him and told him before, you'll never guess what they're going to do. They're going to screw Bret tonight. Number one, I would have had to call from a payphone because nobody had a cell phone then. And I wasn't going to call Star Maker Bolin on a payphone from Canada to tell him about a finish that I didn't know about. So, but Kenny's about as reliable as Bruce sometimes. Anyway, so that's what happened. And I want to save it until I've got more voice, but as a matter of fact, maybe we can do that next week also. But the following month was basically my last month on the creative team, and I'll explain how that happened when I got more voice. But as of this point, as of this day, I never brought it up to Vince again, and he never fucking made a comment to me again. We just looked at each other and never talked about it. It was like a goddamn mob hit. It was like the thing you do not discuss, but we know when we see each other. But, like I said, it was 2 weeks later that I came to Louisville for Thanksgiving vacation and met Danny Davis, or ran into Danny Davis. I knew him so long, and saw OVW and saw an escape hatch to get out of Connecticut. And that's when I went on my diet. I went from 280 in November of 97 to 198 in July of 99 when I moved to Louisville. I had something to live for again. And the following year, I'd gone back to at Thanksgiving again, and that's when I worked his TV and worked with some of his guys and talked to him about an idea for a developmental program, and then started selling it to JR. So within that 2-month period, October and November of 97, the fucking chaos, trying to write that show, trying to write what Vince wanted, what the stars would do, the thing with Pillman. Then here comes this goddamn deal. Then I run into Danny and see OVW and see a lifeline. And then I inadvertently give Russo the opportunity to Iggy me off the creative team, which was fine with me because I was making the same amount of money and I didn't have to look at him once a week. So, which there's a misconception that I'm mad about that. I was happy when I got that job, and I was even happier when it was over with because I was still making the same amount of money and not sitting with him one day a week and not having to sit with the principal as well. That was all within October and November. And from then on, My thing was just getting to Louisville, and Russo's thing was, that's when they brought Ferrara in. I was there for his audition. Jesus Christ. Because Ferrara liked to watch Jerry Springer too. So Bruce was in the office. I was doing third-party stuff. And the two numbnuts took over Vince's attention for a year and a half and hot-shotted the thing to oblivion. And we've still not recovered. But once again, that's the only thing I've never told before because I was halfway ashamed of it. I didn't want to screw Bret. Bret was the one I liked. I'd have loved to have screwed Shawn, but he was not the one that was leaving. And to be honest, I'm sitting there in Connecticut, as I said, miserable, blah, blah, blah. And here's Bret's going to make $2.8 million, and Shawn's guaranteed $750,000 a year. And I'm going, fuck me. So it was frustration and a history lesson from fucking Scott Teal and his wrestling reprints that led to the Montreal screw job. I'm sorry to pop anybody's bubble if that's not as complicated a story as it needs to be. But I was challenged to figure a fucking finish. And that's what I do. These are the things I do.
In the Observer, I wanted to ask you about one thing, because Dave does a day-by-day breakdown of the original issue covering everything. November 8th, 97. There's this quote that I always found funny. At about the same time, the WWF Brain Trust was in Montreal one day early. Vince McMahon held a meeting at the hotel with Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, Pat Patterson, and Michaels. Reports...
No, whoa. Here's the thing. Michaels came into the production meeting. But the meeting was not just with those people. That was the production meeting. And Kevin Dunn was there. And if there was another agent that wasn't in Detroit that night, they were there. And whoever was directing at that time, I can't remember, David Sahadi might have been. The main people in television, the main people in creative, it was a regularly scheduled production meeting, but Michaels came and sat in on it.
Reports are that at least two of the aforementioned names looked extremely uncomfortable leaving the meeting.
I was always uncomfortable when I went into those fucking meetings because I knew they were going to last 3 fucking hours, and I'd already knew all this shit. I did not report that because I wasn't caring about anybody else but myself. And when we got out of there, that's why I asked Vince. I said, "Have you got to finish?" And he said, yes. I said, okay. And I went back to my room. But then I later found out from the Observer, I think first, and then by asking, is this true? That night, Jerry Briscoe was there. That's right, because Jerry Briscoe had gone into the hotel room with Shawn Michaels trying to give him a crash course in fucking defending himself or shooting or whatever. He tried to show him a few things. It was one of those deals that Vince would say. Vince would say, Gerald, go show Shawn a few things in case he has to take care of himself. Well, what the fuck? He's going to turn him into goddamn Carl Gotch overnight in a fucking hotel room. But that's the kind of thing that Vince would do. So, but that happened. But I didn't know it was going to happen at the time.
How often do you see Bret when you do your limited appearances each year?
Well, that's the thing. He was so nice. I saw him the last time in 2016. He was in England when JR and I did that show, and I did the show with Kenny McIntosh, and he came out and guested and was great, and people loved seeing him. I like Bret. I respect Bret. I used to think Bret took himself too seriously, but now that's refreshing. He took himself and the business seriously, and as opposed to the guys today that don't give a fuck about anything and just puke on each other, but that's the worst thing I ever had to say about him. Loved his brother Owen. The whole family's fucking... nuts in a good way, just so colorful and etc. But I even said they cut this out of the Viceland thing. I said, God damn it. He wouldn't do anything else I fucking pitched. He does this one thing. So that once again, I never wanted credit for it, but two things happen. Number one, Vice comes and says 20 years later, we're going to do a fucking national TV documentary. And the behind the curtain deal with IDW, that's the one story they wanted to do. And I said, all right, if I was ever going to fucking say this, now's the time. And it's covered in behind the curtain also with more detail on And I gave the Viceland guys 6 hours of this history also because, the deal was that it was a revenge double cross on Lewis for double crossing the fucking guy he double crossed when Paul Bowser had put up the 70 grand, right? To have Gus Sonnenberg the champion.
Yeah.
But then Sonnenberg got the shit kicked out of him on the street. So they switched it to Ed Don George without asking Lewis and Mont. So well, fuck you. So Lewis goes to get the belt back. It was constant double crosses in those days. I'd been reading that and I gave him but of course they're not going to go that deep into, at least Strangler Lewis was on TV tonight, right? At least we got that much, but they couldn't go into that detail, but that's the way wrestling worked. And Bret knew exactly what to look for. Watch his shoulders, talk to the referee, don't let him count him down. And if there wasn't a reason, that's the thing about figuring finishes. It's not just, I'll do this to you and you do this to me. There was no reason for Shawn Michaels to ever put a submission hold on Bret Hart because he didn't use them. That wasn't his thing anyway. And Bret would have smelled it. But the idea of a spot where, Shawn gets your hold, but then you power out and reverse it, that was the enticement to get him in the thing to begin with. You have to, it's another reason why Russo's an idiot. He just said, just slam bang, put the hold on him and ring the bell. How you going to talk Bret into getting in that fucking hold, you idiot? That's the reason why Vince Russo in WWF, TNA, or anywhere he's ever worked, never agented one match. He'd do the interviews, not the matches. He was never asked to and wouldn't if he was.
Do you really
he didn't know anything about it?
Do you really have it in your will that you're going to piss on his grave? What did you say in the documentary?
I can't comment on ongoing legal documents. I said, if I'm incapacitated and unable to fucking do it on my own, Stacy is out of the will if she doesn't assist me to get there and do that.
That's right. Oh, please let me get the filming rights.
But anyway, and if Bret is listening to this, and I don't know why he would be, because he's got more money than the federal government to this day, I'm sure, and doesn't need all this shit. But I do apologize. But once again, if the fucking billionaire dares me to come up with a fucking finish, and out of frustration and just not giving a shit. And just being beaten up physically and mentally by the whole goddamn thing. When I get cranky, I suggest shit like that. But that's basically the story. And next week, we'll possibly have some comments from Mr. Meltzer. And also we will talk, when I can talk more, about my last month on the creative team and how happy I was when Russo Iggy'd me out, but how that went about too. Which I've actually never really told that story either. And I've never to this day, Vince McMahon never told me you're off the creative team. I'll tease you with this. It's hard without telling the whole story, but I talked to Beth, Vince's secretary, and said, boy, if I missed that day, is that okay? Because we're up here doing this TV shoot. Sure, we'll call you and let you know when to come back. And they just never did. And I never mentioned it again. I was like, every week I was like, I don't have to go to Vince's. I don't have to go to Vince's.
You see, if this was WCW, you'd be getting a check for $125,000 a year.
Well, yeah. But that's why they're still in business. They ran a halfway fucking reputable business.
Hey, I know we're not going to go much longer because obviously your voice can't hold up. But one question I did want to ask you, because one part of the documentary I did think, why even focus attention on this? But I'd like to get your thoughts. Is the idea of the conspiracy theory,
yes.
That it was all work, that everyone was in on it. What are your thoughts on the conspiracy theory? And just to clear everything up, to the best of your knowledge, and obviously you were on the inside here, who actually knew what was going to happen in the ring that night? Right before that it was going to happen. Let's go to that.
Okay. Well, first of all, and they used Scott Hall. I talked to the producers, and they said, well, it's out there, that opinion is out there, so we wanted to have somebody represent it. And, if Scott genuinely believes that, then he should discuss with one of his best friends for the past 25 years the fact he's been lying to him for 20 fucking years. Or elsewise he was just saying that to get more camera time. But anybody who thinks that it was nothing that is scripted works out that well.
Ain't that the truth? Yeah.
So that's just completely ridiculous. And what was the second part of your question?
Who actually knew? I mean, who were the actual people that knew the double cross was going down before it went down?
Well, I don't know for sure everybody, but I can tell you that Shawn had to know, and he's admitted it. I think he probably told Triple H. Hebner, in the manner in which he just related on the show, was told very shortly beforehand. Jerry Briscoe had to know because he was doing the workout deal. Vince knew. Once again, I genuinely believe that Pat and or Bruce, neither one knew because Vince would protect them from being in that position.
Shane McMahon was there that day. He would have known too then?
I bet you Shane was not, at that point, was not, as important as he is now in the company. He was just starting at that time. He'd just gotten out of college, but probably Vince said, hey, this is what we're going to do. So, and that's the thing, the punch, the whole 9 yards in the locker room, that was a real deal because Vince went to take the fucking shot that he knew Bret was going to give him. He felt like he owed him that.
Now, you didn't know they were going to use your finish, but did you know the double cross was going down before it went down?
No, that's what I'm saying. I thought it was a fucking run-in DQ too. Because I'm seeing Bulldog and Owen at the gorilla position waiting to run in. Okay, they're going to do this bullshit DQ, but they're going to have this big fight and act like it got unprofessional. And the first time that I realized that it was going to be what it was when they did the spot where Shawn started. And as Bret showed you, he had to get into it himself because Shawn didn't know how to do it. But when they were doing that for a second, I was like, oh, they're not. Oh, they are. Oh, shit. And once he got in it, I said, oh, this is it. That's when I knew. So I don't know what more to say at this point.
Well, we could keep going, but just I guess we kind of exposed it earlier. This is now late at night on Wednesday.
Yes, it's midnight, and I've been talking to people all day, and I'm still not back in my form. But I apologize to Bret. I apologize more to I helped kill kayfabe. And see, that was the thing. Afterwards, Bret was so upset about it, and looking in hindsight, rightfully so. And also, if we'd have bothered to sit there for another 30 minutes and talk about what he would think about after we did all this, we probably wouldn't have done it. But since I was dared to come up with a double cross that would hold water, I did. Vince blew it off. We continued, never talked about it again. I certainly didn't give it the thought that, well, probably in 20 years, Bret's still going to be mad. Maybe we shouldn't ought to do that. But Vince apparently thought, but once again, he took it the other way. He let everybody know what he had done rather than trying to kayfabe it from everybody. So it completely changed the complexion of the thing. And, Bret's calling the newspapers, Bret's going on TV. It was, yes, billionaire Mr. McMahon was the greatest heel character of all time. And yes, they entered a golden period. But when we peeled so much of the curtain back, you couldn't go back from those things. And now, after the hot shotting, they never have gone back after all those things. But so once again, like I said, my finish on a dare led to more exposing of the business as a work and the behind the scenes manipulations of same than anything else that's ever been done. So I bear this shame. Maybe somebody should piss on my grave.
Well, tune in next week when Jim talks with our guest, Eddie Mansfield. About...
Oh, shut up. God damn you. But anyway, we will try to talk more about that following month, which is interesting also, and et cetera, when I have more voice.
Hold on, one more thing I have to ask.
All right, well, go ahead. I'm bearing my soul here.
One more question. Just on this topic that you came up with this finish, they ended up using the finish to your surprise, and you've kept it inside other than a few people who have known about it. You haven't said anything. Is it something you've been dying to say? Is it something you've wanted to say? Hey.
No.
Not that you're proud of it, because obviously you're not proud that you finished prep, but you know what I mean.
But no, here's the thing: that when I've skirted with the issue before, because I never try to take credit for it or try to even really tell a story until everybody else did. And somebody said Shawn came up with the idea. Well, yeah, like Shawn Michaels talked Bret Hart into getting in his own fucking thing, right? But the biggest thing was dipshit, shit stain. Well, I told him, and he put it in his book, and he said, I just have him put his hold on and ring the bell. Well, you fucking moron. That's what you think wrestling is. Just tell these trained monkeys to just do this. And how are you going to get to that point? Vince McMahon, the best negotiator in the history of wrestling, couldn't talk these guys into a fucking finish, right? You're going to, you fucking moron. But so I've tried to tell people when people were blatantly lying without admitting the whole truth. But at this point, like I said, 20 years, a TV documentary, the graphic novel, if it's not now, it's never. And it just to set the goddamn record straight, because it was, once again, I said, nothing that's written ever comes out this good. You can't, even though this broke kayfabe, it actually, to me, perpetuated the idea that the things that will draw the most money that people will believe in most are the things that are real. Because this was real. It was just a byproduct of this real thing that we had to expose kayfabe. Because if Bret didn't really lose the belt and he didn't really win the belt, then by extension, all other things in wrestling were work but because this was real, it got everybody's attention and drew money. It's a conundrum wrapped in an enigma, and it doesn't make any fucking sense. And wrestling has been trying to work, shoot, work ever since then. Everything else we've ever done is phony, but this is real this week. Just like it was 2 weeks ago, last time we said that. It's all off of this. It led us down a slippery slope and a primrose path to fucking bullshit and gaga. And now it's holiday on ice in a fucking wrestling ring. This was the start of that. So I'm obviously not proud of it. And like I said, I'm sorry, Bret, but fuck, it wasn't my call, you know, but don't dare me to come up with a fucking finish. But you know, that's just so to answer your question. No, I've never really wanted to come out. I just wanted to come out and tell people when people were lying. But then I wouldn't tell the whole truth, and then it wasn't as great as of a statement as it could be about these people are full of shit. Because, well, how do you know? Well, here's the true story. I wasn't telling the true story, so I don't know. Whatever the fuck.
Once Bret signed the deal with WCW, and you knew he was leaving, what was Vince's reaction when anyone would suggest have him drop it to anyone other than Shawn, who he hates more than anything in the world? Have him drop it to anyone else. Because it seems like if, you know, every Vince scenario was get it on Shawn. And we don't have to go into the whole, his reliability, his drug issues and everything. But just in terms of, if that's the issue with Bret, get it on Undertaker, get it on Shamrock, get it on someone. What was Vince's reaction when he would hear a suggestion for someone other than Shawn?
Well, that's the thing. By that point, it was too late. It was like they'd already announced the match. and besides that, I think Vince would have been admitting defeat if he switched it. And he'd have set a bad precedent with the boys. Oh, you don't want to drop the belt to this guy? Well, we'll change the match and you can drop it to the guy you want to drop it to. He'd be setting a precedent. And I think he'd be admitted. And Vince McMahon Sr.'s cardinal rule that Vince Jr. would repeat on numerous occasions, get the match in the ring. The guy's holding you up on the big show, the stadium, whatever. Get the match in the ring, give him what he wants, and then fuck him afterwards. Or just get rid of him afterwards or whatever the fuck. Get the match in the ring. And I think he was trying to do that. And, I mean, once again, remember, he's still the boss, and I was not as abrasive then as I am now, but I couldn't just come out and say, God damn it, Vince, why didn't you fucking take the belt off of him 2 months ago before you reneged on his contract? But I wanted to constantly, Vince, why didn't you fucking take the belt off of him 2 months ago before you told him you were reneging on his contract? See, that's another thing. It's another murder mystery that the creative team was asked to help finish when they didn't start it. Vince McMahon would tell you who got killed, who the killer was, and what the location was, and then say, okay, go write the book. And that's what the creative does. So in this case, he said, okay, I want Bret to drop the title to Shawn. but Bret don't want to, and he's got creative control in his contract that I signed for the last 60 days. And, oh, by the way, I didn't bother to have him drop the belt before I told him that I wasn't going to pay him the money I agreed to, and he can go get his other deal back if he can still get it from Bischoff, and we'll work Bischoff. Because that was the thing. He said, just say you've got a loophole, say you've got an out. We'll write it in a clause that you can send to him, and then you see if you can still get the fucking deal from Bischoff. Vince was going that far to work with Bret to get him out of the deal that he signed for him not even a year earlier. And then, when you know who won the pony, the company turned around in the next 6 months after they fucked Bret, and he could pay him just fine.
And by the way, Bischoff, for everything bad we could say about Bischoff, and there's good and bad to say about him, obviously, it seems like this is one scenario where he kind of handled everything well. Where he kind of let everything play out. He just sat back. He said, I got him under contract. You need an extra week? You can have an extra week. So originally the plan was Bret was going to stay with the WWF until December.
Yeah, and at one point, one of the suggestions was that he stay until the December pay-per-view and drop it in some kind of four-way deal or whatever in December and so get a 30-day extension. That was right in there late in the game before he came up with the idea of just relinquishing it on Raw, and Bischoff had agreed to that. But here was the thing, and I'm glad you brought that up because this is important that people understand. People have said, oh, Bret was going to go and throw the belt in a garbage can, or was going to show up on Nitro the next night live, or was going to this or that.
No, he wasn't.
And no, he wasn't. And Meltzer has pointed out that they established legal precedent with the belt. You couldn't have the belt. It was intellectual property, blah, blah, blah. But and Dave was taking a piss out of some of it because some people were still perpetuating the idea that this was what was going to happen. Vince McMahon did not ever believe that Bret Hart was going to show up on live TV or throw the belt in a garbage can or do anything other than what he said he was going to do as far as Bret showing up on WTV. Here was the fucking issue. The issue was, because back in those days, the internet was not a thing. And the only way that you could communicate instantly, the wrestling promotions, was on live TV. Vince was going to be live on Sunday night. Bischoff was going to be live on Monday night. The question in Vince's mind was, I can trust Bret not to do any of these things, but can I trust Eric Bischoff not to come out and say, ladies and gentlemen, we have signed the current WWF champion, Bret Hart. He's going to be here in 31 days. It was because Vince didn't trust Bischoff not to reveal the news, because that would have been the same. If this was still wrestling in those days, even if Bret had come out on TV the next night, which he wasn't, but even if Bischoff had said on TV the next night, we've signed Bret Hart, after he lost the belt, it would look like, oh, the guy lost the belt. He's fucking mad. He's leaving. He's going to another place, whatever, right? But when you have signed the other company's current world champion, you have fucked that guy's wife right in front of him on television. You have kicked that guy's dog. You have emasculated him. You have made him your bitch in the wrestling world in those days. And that's what Vince was trying to forestall, avoid, whatever the fuck. He did not trust Bret, but he didn't trust Bischoff with his company in his hands. He was given, he would have been putting the WWF's not necessarily future, but definitely their public image in the hands of Eric Bischoff. He would have been the ultimate fucking, Vince saw that, I'm sure, as being Bischoff's bitch. He can't let somebody else have that much power over him. He had to do something that night. He might get Bret, but he's not getting my champion. And that's why I believe in hindsight, that's why he did what he did. He took, and it could have been that day because, like Bruce said, Vince McMahon can talk you into doing all kinds of shit you never would have walked into that room intending to do, right? And it may have been till that day when Vince said, I can get this some way. I can get this in the ring. I can get it, whatever. And then when he realized that he couldn't, he had already made the fucking backup plan the night before with Jerry Briscoe and the fucking shoot wrestling lesson. I'm sure that was like Billy Robinson coaching, good Lord. But he had that, said, okay, if all else fails, we'll do it, I guess. Because once again, I never brought it up again. We never mentioned it. He didn't either, to this day. But
now you've claimed your spot in the history books
that I didn't want.
That you didn't want.
That I didn't want. But Danny Davis used to call me the weasel in OVW because I would weasel my way out of whatever corner they painted me in. When they brought my feuding program, heel and babyface, up as a tag team, when they pulled this guy or they sent that guy or they changed this guy's name or they put a mask on Matt Morgan, I would figure out logical finishes or ways to explain it on interviews or things that where it just didn't hang there because of my OCD. I have to, the details, right? And one of the things I've been able to do from learning from all of these guys, Bill Dundee and Bill Watts, Dusty Rhodes, whatever, there's a way to do a finish for anything. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, whatever. But there's a finish for everything. And finishes, like I said, are not just you do this to me and I'll do this to you and then you hit that big move. You're planting seeds. You're telling a story. You're making things make sense logically, even to a fan who doesn't really know the behind the scenes business. But when they're watching it, nothing pops out at that fan as slaps you in the face with it's uncharacteristic or it shouldn't be there, or that you don't follow a shooting with a stabbing. The big crossbody that gets the huge pop, and then you go 2 more minutes because that's what you had figured, right? You build these things. You put things in the right places. I've been good with finishes, sometimes to my detriment. But there you have it. And I would be interested in feedback or death threats, whatever.
What about that? In the middle of the documentary, all of a sudden they have to have you show one of the death threats you've received on the wall?
Well, no, they shot here for 6 hours. We did stuff for several of their specials on different subjects. And they asked me to give them a tour around the vault. And so I was just showing them some things, but they were somewhat fascinated by my, dive into history because, even Evan Husney, who's the producer we had on the show here, he's been a longtime wrestling fan, but I don't think he knew just how much history there was in the business to the backstories of things and why things are the way they are. And like I said, in the program, you can learn from history because it always repeats itself. And it didn't even dawn on me that it was Montreal until after the whole thing happened. That was just an odd side note that both those things happened in Montreal. Lewis and DeGlane in 31 and Michaels and Hart in 97. But that makes it a kind of a cool story that there were 2 Montreal screw jobs and one of them instigated the other one. And Scott Teal was involved too. Goddamn you, Scott.
No, I like the fact that they got your death threat in, and also they made sure to make some space in the documentary for Bret to say that Tammy was sleeping with Shawn.
Well, yes, but he winked when he said it, but when that ground has already been covered, or that row has already been plowed, or whatever what old adage you want to use.
You could use whatever old adage you want.
Oh, shut up. All right, at least I got you at midnight, right? I can barely talk, and you're a fucking babbling mess. We could do this all night, and it seems like we already have. But, folks, I hope I sound better this weekend this coming Monday when we do the drive-through, and next week on this program. But I just need some fucking rest. I'm too busy being irrelevant and changing the course of wrestling history. Well, folks, at this point, there's been all kinds of controversy over last week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring on Vice TV about the Montreal screw job and who knew what and who didn't and my revelations. And Harley Quinn even got a thank you in the credits. We appreciate that, guys. But also, we wanted to bring in probably the guy who knows more about this from all sides than anybody else in or outside of wrestling. He is, of course, the editor, publisher, creator, originator of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, and he is a savant when it comes to wrestling details, and that's why we have him here today. Dave Meltzer, thank you, Dave, for being on this program.
Oh yeah, thanks. I listened to your show on it. It was absolutely fascinating. I mean, the whole thing with Montreal is that if you're like a fan in 2019 and you look at this and it's like there's like 50 things that will just boggle your mind about it. Like, how could this happen? Why would this happen? And it's like, but in 1997, it wasn't that weird. And if it was the 70s, it wouldn't be the slightest bit weird because, as you know, and you talked about, it's like one of the keys to why this happened was because of the value of that championship and what it meant to Vince McMahon and what it meant to Bret Hart and what it meant to everybody in the industry. And now it's, the championship, it still means a lot, but it's not in the same way. I mean, it's passed around. Everybody gets a shot, so to speak. In those days, I mean, you could count on your hands the number of real world champions that there were. And those guys are all, every one of them is like practically a surefire Hall of Famer. If you held that title, whether it was WWF, if you held the championship, Bruno Sammartino or Backlund, I mean, you could name the guys off the top of your head that held it, right? And then on the NWA side, it was the same thing. You could. Oh,
you knew the dates. You knew the dates they won it and the dates they lost it.
Right. You could do the lineage from Thez on, I wouldn't say any fan, but any historian would trace, Thez to, Watson to Thez to Hutton to, that whole line. They could do it and easily. Yeah.
Well, and here's the thing. We got to say this to top of the program. And we mentioned this last week here on the show. Also, it was a 45-minute television program and you can't do this has been covered like the Kennedy assassination. You did, I don't know how many issues on it for weeks afterwards. And you can't do all the details and the dates and the places and the contracts and et cetera in a 45-minute television program without commercials. But it was an overall view of how important the backstage manipulations and meanderings were in wrestling, how important the championship was, the length that people would go to especially in that promotional war. But it also shows that basically wrestling, there have been some cliches or some, the platitudes in wrestling. Well, exposés are bad. This is bad. That's bad. It always came from something. The reason why, and I remember this story, and then we'll talk about the show here in a second, but when Chris Candido won the NWA title in 1995, right? Mm-hmm. He actually ran into, by accident, Lou Thez in an airport bathroom. And he was so excited. And he told me about it as soon as he got back to Knoxville. He said, I ran into Lou Thez. He said, I went up, I introduced myself, and Mr. Thez, it's so great to meet you, sir. I'm a wrestler, and blah, blah, blah. And Lou had asked him, well, what are you doing? And he was almost like not wanting to really say this, right? But he had to. He's like, well, currently, sir, I'm the NWA world champion. And the thing that Thez told him was, well, be careful, kid. When you go around to these different territories, somebody's going to try to double cross you. Yeah. And in 1990 something, even that was, we kind of chuckled about it. But that's because there were so many double crosses in the formative years of wrestling. I think I tweeted not so long ago that how many from 1905 to 1945, how many world title changes were legitimate double crosses? A decent percentage.
Yeah. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I would think 6 or 7. And I mean, certainly the whole, in many ways, if you look at the real history of wrestling in that era, a lot of the double crosses were kind of like the formation, the formative, stuff of history, like with the Wayne Munn and Zbyszko and the She-Cat and Dan O'Mahony. Those were like major switches. They changed history. So in a lot of ways. And I mean, the whole history. If you look at the narrative of how history was shaped, well, not every world title change was a double cross. Those double crosses changed so much about how the history in the 20s and 30s in particular, because really most of that stuff was the 20s and 30s, how it changed, and also why even as late as Jack Briscoe, I remember when I don't know if you know the story, when Jack Briscoe won the world title from Harley Race, so this is 73, Don Owens wrote a letter to Sam Mushnick, goes, thank God, and not that Harley Race wasn't a tough guy, he goes, but thank God we've got a champion who's a real wrestler. We don't have to worry about double crosses. I mean, even though Dory Funk Jr. was a real tough guy and Harley Race was a real tough guy, you know what I mean? But like all of those guys again that we talked about, Kiniski, who was a really tough guy. It's like Luthez. One of the things of being a world champion is that, you had to be a great athlete and a real tough guy and a guy that, that someone's not going to manipulate into a submission hold so easy. I mean, that was one of the prerequisites of being the champion, really through Harley Race, I would say.
Yeah, through the 70s. And going back to the second Gotch and Hackenschmidt match, it was technically a double cross, even though Gotch was always supposed to win. Hackenschmidt got hurt, shady circumstances. They couldn't cancel the match because it was going to be the all-time record gate. And so Gotch agrees, well, I tell you what, we'll go 2 out of 3. I'll carry you to a good showing before I win the third fall. And that was the agreement to get him in the ring. And then he shut him down in 2 straight falls and ate him up and killed Hackenschmidt's career. Same way when they double crossed, Shikat double crossed O'Mahony because O'Mahony wasn't a real wrestler. It killed the biggest draw in the business, Gus Sonnenberg. When that happened, he was huge.
Yeah, if you look back at O'Mahony for those 2 years before Shikat beat him, I mean, he was one of the biggest short-term drawing cards in the history of wrestling. He was doing stadiums, especially in Boston. He was doing stadiums in Boston and doing 35,000 people all the time. And he was only a young guy. He was in his early 20s, when the 21, 22 years old was going on. I mean, he could have been it, but the problem was that he couldn't wrestle. I mean, he wasn't a good performer and he couldn't wrestle. But for whatever reason, you know how this goes. I mean, he had the charisma and he had the look. And people
Irish in Boston,
he was a world beater. What?
Irish in Boston. That didn't hurt.
Irish in Boston, but he drew outside of Boston too. But Boston, he was like the king.
Yeah.
And then Shikat double crossed him, and yet it pretty much exposed him, and people wouldn't buy him after that because of how badly he was double crossed. I mean, how badly he looked in the double cross. And then Shikat pretty much lost his mind because he just realized what he did and needed to get that belt off because he said someone was going to kill him. So that act, people actually will point to the Shikat O'Mahony match for ending what in fact had been several years of a boom period. Because if you look at those early 30s, even though there was the Depression and everything, like with Londos and Lewis and O'Mahony and people like that, that was a real big period for pro wrestling. And then because of the Shikat thing, it came out, in the papers and in the media that in fact, wrestling was worked and Shikat whatever, but Shikat double-crossed Mahoney, and then O'Mahony was a terrible wrestler, which came out, which killed O'Mahony, and also it really killed the popularity of the business. Of all the double crosses, that one probably killed the popularity of the business the most.
Well, and that's the thing, even when I was getting in the business and being smartened up in the 70s and in early 80s, these were still the rules of thumb because it had such impact on the business years before. If you're a world champion, watch out for double crosses. Exposés of the business will kill the business because the biggest expose had been in the 30s in New York, the New York papers. For 25 years after that, savaged wrestling. And there was no wrestling in Madison Square Garden from 1939 to 1951. And the only way they got it back, if you go and look at this for a recent article I did in Fighting Spirit magazine, it was more obvious to me. And I realized New York came back in the early 50s on the back of Argentina Rocca, because Thez didn't draw, Gagne didn't draw, Rocca drew, then Bruno drew.
Rocca and Gene Stanley was the big one. But
it was here's where I was going with that. It was the ethnic hero, the formula that they found, because think about this. Even in those days in New York, there were Italian newspapers. There were Spanish language newspapers. The English language, the major New York papers were still ripping the shit out of phony wrestling, but they managed to bypass that publicity somewhat by having the ethnic heroes that their fans were not reading the New York Times. And
Maybe
I think there's something to, and remember all the times that the WWF television was on the Spanish language TV stations. Yeah. They managed to bypass that bad publicity, and that's why it led to, for 40 years, they were led by an ethnic hero, because that was what finally worked after wrestling had been dead because of the exposés. And back then, before the internet, there was no way to really do a national expose, and unless somebody had time, right? So I'm going to put this on the Associated Press, is going to go everywhere. So pockets of the country where the business would be exposed, business would go down, and henceforth it was the rule of thumb. World champions, watch out for double crosses. If the newspapers expose our business, we're going to be dead. We have to. Those were all the things that were, rules of thumb in wrestling, because they were rooted in those things actually happening years and years before.
It's interesting because Madison Square Garden went dark for wrestling for several years, as you mentioned. The first show back was actually Gorgeous George on top, because Gorgeous George was so big on television, and Gorgeous George was drawing everywhere. And then Gorgeous George came to the Garden, and it got a lot of publicity because it was Gorgeous George, who was one of the biggest stars of television at the time. And I forget the number, but it was like
4,000 people. 4,000 people.
He drew a terrible house in Madison Square Garden. And then they didn't do another show until Rocca and Stanley. And then Rocca and Stanley did almost like 18,000 people. And that started the Rocca era for like probably the next, whatever it was, 9 years, where Rocca was on top, and Rocca drew, he drew good to great every single show. But, like you said, like Fez didn't draw on top at all. And George, it's like George was drawn everywhere, and George didn't draw in New York.
If you go back and look at the newspaper articles, when the newspapers announced wrestling coming back to the Garden and Gorgeous George, they were just taking the piss out of Gorgeous. They took the piss out of everything that wrestling did.
Made fun of him.
Yeah. Until finally, when they were selling out and turning people away, then they would still make the backhand comments like, well, the show, or the hippodroming, or, the vaudeville or whatever, but they had to acknowledge the huge crowds. But it was a rocky road there, because that expose in the 30s is what led to the Fall Guys, which thank goodness, that book was printed once and then reprinted 60 years later by Scott Teal, which we're going to talk about a little bit. Scott Teal has a part to play in this, as we all know now. But that's the thing, is that everybody today laughs at all the things that the wrestlers and the wrestling promoters used to believe 20 and 30 and 40 years ago, but those things were rooted in reality. They had happened, and they didn't want them to happen again.
For the time, that was what it was. Yeah. But yeah, like going back to George, I remember when George was in the Garden, I remember the articles after. I mean, it was the papers kind of even were gloating, like, well, the George stuff may play in Los Angeles big, but here in New York, we're way too sophisticated for this stuff.
Yeah.
I remember that tone, like it didn't work, and he couldn't work in, but George really worked just about everywhere but New York. That was like the only place, because George was an incredible draw for the, for that 2-3 year period.
Yeah, and then, when Rocca hit so big, and then when he started cooling off, they brought in Miguel Perez. They made him his partner so that they had a different dynamic, but it was still the Puerto Rican and the Italian and the Hispanic audience. And then immediately went to Bruno. It was for 30 years you had to,
and then Pedro Morales,
and then Morales, yeah, and then Bruno again for 30 something years you had to have the ethnic hero. And part of it obviously is because Bruno was a once in a lifetime talent, but part of it was because that was the way they were able to rebuild the business after the media just wanted nothing to fucking do with it.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
With Bruno in the second run, I think by that point,
that got past it. Yeah.
But by that point, I mean, Bruno was just like a sports legend that everyone, like across all ethnic boundaries, loved Bruno. I mean, he drew everywhere, as far as the Northeast, because he was like he became a sports legend on the second run. Like the first run when he was coming up, I do believe, because the audience had changed too. It was like because they said like the audience that went, within 2-3 years, the Rocca fans were gone, and it was the Bruno fans, and Bruno drew his own unique fans, and then, and he was the Italian, Bruno at first was the Italian sports hero, but in time, Bruno became the hero to the downtrodden, but to everyone, even rich people. You know what I mean? It's like Bruno was like that part of your life. Like every month you knew he's going to go there and he was going to kick ass, and he would never disappoint you. Even if he lost, he would get it. He would win back in the rematch, and it was a fantastic formula for its time.
Well, let's talk about the program from this past week. And I mentioned that it's 45-minute programs. They couldn't put all the details in. And obviously there's things, obviously Scott Hall either just wanted to be in it, so he said that, or he legitimately believes it, in which case his brain is mush. And that's 30 seconds or a minute that could have been, utilized for something more positive. But some people were criticizing the program. Some people loved the program. Some people were in the middle. What were your thoughts, first of all, before we go any further?
Well, here's the funny thing, because I had been told several reporters actually had seen it before I did. And so they hated it. They absolutely hated it. So, and one of my best friends saw it, and he was kind of telling me about it as well. And so I went in there with the idea that I'm going to hate it. And I think because of that, I didn't hate it. You know what I mean? Because I was already told, okay, this isn't in, and this isn't in, and this isn't in, and this is the way it's portrayed. And it's like, okay, I know that. So then, I enjoyed most of it. I thought that the idea that, as one of the things of that movie was that, and the same with Wrestling with Shadows too, is it created the idea that it was Bret's last night with a promotion. So Vince had no, he had to either get the belt off him or not. And it really, I think the one thing is that Bret had still had 3 weeks left on his contract, and then he still had another week that Bischoff had allowed him to stay one extra week if you need to, so you could go out the right way. The
December pay-per-view and do a 4-way.
The December pay-per-view were the 4-way thing. So it was like, it's like there's that if it was Bret's last night, absolutely his last night, you're in a war and all this, and Bret's not going to lose, there is a justification for what Vince did. But, and that's been, almost historically, that's the one fact that people go, but and it's mostly from Wrestling with Shadows. It's like, it was his last night. What choice did Vince have? And it was like, well, it was his last night because he double-crossed him and Bret wouldn't come back. And they both knew that was after it happened, this was going to be his last night. But, his contract, he had another 3 to 4 weeks to go. And also, the thing that Bruce said at the very beginning, and Bruce actually told me this the day after, so I believe Bruce believed that and knew that and was told it from Vince, was, Bret wouldn't do the job on the way out. He just refused every scenario. And he did it, he refused every scenario but one.
Yeah.
to lose to Shawn Michaels. And there's no doubt that was, that losing to Shawn Michaels was a huge issue. But I like I said, I've seen, some of the legal papers that went back and forth between Bret's lawyer and Vince as they're negotiating a finish because of the creative control aspect. They had to negotiate a finish. And Bret brought up, legitimately brought up in one of the letters, it was like, because of everything that's happened with me and Shawn, I'd rather not lose to Shawn, but I would love, I don't think he used the word love, but it was like, it would be my honor or something.
Yeah.
He'd be very happy to lose to Steve Austin on any day, anytime. I don't want to lose in Canada. I'll lose in the United States. He was protective of losing in Canada. And people make fun of that, but he had his reasons. And the fact is that aside from those 3 days, the whole month was in the United States. There was a Madison Square Garden. There's a Raw taping in Greensboro. And if he wanted to do a pay-per-view, he could have done it on the pay-per-view.
Well, now I gotta bring this up because that weekend Detroit was in the middle of Toronto and Montreal, and then he said, "Well, I don't want to lose in Detroit because then it would screw the people in Montreal out of seeing the title match that was advertised." And to be honest, he never should. Here's the thing. The whole reason why he wouldn't do a job for Shawn, he was justified because they didn't explain it quite well or the way it was edited in the program, but where he went up to Shawn and shook his hand and said, "I want you to always be safe and blah, blah, blah with you'll always be safe with me." The point is, he had gone up to Shawn and said something of that nature, and that, I'll be professional, I'll put you over, whatever. And then Shawn's line was, and help me on this if this is not correct, but basically Shawn's line was, well, that's great of you, because I wouldn't put you over for $1 million or something like. Well, what the fuck?
It was like it's really nice, but if the situation was reversed, I wouldn't return the favor. But he did that 2 or 3 times and once. See, here's the other one. Once was in San Jose, and I was out with a wrestler for dinner after a show, and it was one of Bret's friends, and he's just furious, not even talking. He's just steaming, like he's going to kill somebody. And then finally, like, his dad, who was there, and his dad was just like, what's going on? And then he goes, you can't print this, to me. And he goes, he tells me the story, and he was there, and Bret and Shawn are talking, and somehow in the conversation, Shawn goes kind of making it's just like a smart ass remark, and he just went to Bret and just goes, I'll never put you over. I'll just never put you over.
Yeah.
And, the guy was friends with Bret. Bret was at the time the champion. But it wasn't the conversation that you're talking about. So there was at least 2, and there might've been 3 conversations like that where Shawn was just like, kind of mocking Bret, like, you're working a full-time schedule and I'm not. And I'm, in the main events on the pay-per-view, even though you're the champion, some of which he actually said on interviews. But that specific one was like, I'm never going to put you over, which may have stemmed from him missing the WrestleMania show. Because if you remember, WrestleMania was supposed to be Bret and Shawn, and then Shawn had the knee injury. And
97.
As fate would turn out, it turned out to be Bret and Austin, which is one of the most important matches in the history of pro wrestling, because it's
one of the best
for Austin.
Yeah, and one of the best matches too. And here's the thing that I had told the Vice people, and it didn't get in really as it should. And we said this on a program last week. Vince McMahon and everybody else trusted Bret that he wasn't going to. I mean, it had already been litigated. You couldn't take a belt on somebody else's TV, intellectual property. He wasn't going to throw the belt in the garbage can. He wasn't going to show up on TV if he said he wasn't going to show up. Bret was good for his word, but the bone of contention that I think in Vince McMahon's mind eventually led to doing this was, back in those days, very limited internet, if any. The only way to get the news out to any mainstream audience, not just the newsletter fans or the people who called each other on the phone, was live television. Vince was going to be live at the Survivor Series in Montreal on Sunday. Bischoff, this was because it was the Wednesday where we were sitting having this writing session when he was taking all the phone calls from Bret and Shawn. The next time that Eric Bischoff or WCW would be live would be Monday. Nobody ever thought, and that's where people have taken this thing and run with it. Vince McMahon and nobody else thought that Bret was going to show up on TV the next day. He wasn't contractually able to, nor would he, blah, blah, blah.
He'd have never done it anyway.
But what was preventing Eric Bischoff from coming out and announcing, ladies and gentlemen, I've signed the current WWF champion, Bret Hart, and he's going to be here in 30 days. Not trusting Eric Bischoff, because the question was put to Vince McMahon. We trust Bret. Do you trust Eric Bischoff with your fucking company? And in effect, if he had come out and said, we've signed the champion, he'll be here in 30 days, then that was, as I said on the program, was the equivalent of, fucking Vince's wife in front of him on television, or, emasculating him. It was, that's how important it was at that time. And if they'd announced Bret Hart will be here the day after he lost the belt, okay, the guy lost the belt, now he's going to the other place, right? That was more palatable. But signing away a current world champion had never been done and was not going to be done.
Yeah. The only thing I could say about that is that Bret had signed prior to that, the Monday before. So Eric actually had a Monday, because people have brought this up. Eric had a Monday where he could have said, we've signed Bret Hart. And he didn't. Now, that's not saying he wouldn't the next week. And again, in this one really.
Well, a lot happened in that last week also.
Right. And also during that week, while it was not a big story in the United States, it was in Canada. because Bret was like in two things in Canada. Number one is that the mainstream media covered pro wrestling so much better than in the United States, just because of, history, because of Montreal and Toronto with the Tunnies and everything, where the stigma of pro wrestling in Montreal and Toronto and Calgary as well, in the major markets of Canada, was not like the United States. So wrestling was like I remember when I wrote my first book, it was like I could do any talk show in Canada. I couldn't do nothing in the United States because it was wrestling. Whereas in Canada, it's, you're writing a book on wrestling. That's so cool. And real media would cover you. And by the middle of the week, the Bret stuff had broken. You know what I mean? It was covered in the sports, and a lot of the newspapers, had stuff about, not so much the newspapers, but there was some newspaper, but a lot of the TSN and everything like that, Off the Record. I remember Off the Record, which was a big show then.
Yeah, Landsberg, Alan Landsberg. Yeah.
Michael Landsberg. Michael told everyone that Bret's going to WCW, and not about the championship, that he's going to WCW. And this was before the Montreal match. And I remember Bret was even on a show, and he wouldn't, Bret wouldn't admit to it because that would be wrong for business. But it was like he didn't deny it either, because he didn't want to lie. So he kind of, traipsed his way around it. And then when the show was over, I remember when the interview was over, Michael Landsberg goes, well, I think that, Bret's going to WCW. Like, just like it's,
yeah.
So there were people who knew in Canada already about that. But, again, it was a very tense situation. I don't think people really understood the nature of the war. And now you couldn't, because, there's rivalries, but it was never like this was a real, with both sides. This was kind of like a weird life and death rivalry. They both, I think there was some.
Well, there was tens of millions of dollars. Even at that point, everybody talks about the economics of today, but there were tens of millions of dollars on the line on this thing. Not just in salary to the wrestlers, but also in revenue to the company, to the companies. And hey, help me with this, because this may come as a shock to everybody, but I don't listen to Eric Bischoff's podcast. But what has he? I've heard that recently he's been saying that he didn't offer Bret a contract when he did, and then he. Help me say what is he trying to say now? Because everybody knows what happened then. And we can repeat it. What's he saying now?
I don't know. I think that he, because Eric doesn't like Bret because Bret trashes him constantly because of the creative when he got there, and for good reason. I mean,
they shit the bed on the hottest wrestler in the world.
Yeah, I mean the weird thing, because people, here's the one, and this has even happened a lot in the last week. Now, this is the one that's the weirdest of all. Okay, was that? Did you hear about the interview Earl Hebner did just this week with Bully Ray?
I actually did not, because, and I'd like to apologize to the Busted Open people here on the air, because they contacted me through email to see if I wanted to do that show also, and I had no voice, and I was not looking at emails, and so I didn't do it. But I apologize for that. But did Earl say something the effect of, well, now both of them were in on it? Yeah.
Okay, so it was weird, because Earl goes in and they go like, Earl, do you think it's a work? And he just goes, for 20 years I've been thinking about it, and yeah, like that. Like not definitive, but like, yeah, I think. And then you think Bret and Shawn are in on it. He goes, well, I know, he just goes, I'm positive Shawn's in on it. It's like, well, duh. Yeah. Shawn's admitted that, so that's not a big deal. And he goes, then they go, do you think Bret was in on it? And he goes, yeah. And I go like, what? I mean, it's like, if Bret, why would they do that to you? Why would, like of all people, and plus the fact that Bret wouldn't speak to Earl for God knows how many years.
Yeah.
And they were friends. And, and then when, making up and all this, and it's like, of all the people, it's like, I can sort of understand some fans, thinking that everything's, a work in pro wrestling, thinking it's a work. But like Earl Hebner and guys and some of the guys in the business today now that weren't around in '97, I can sort of see them watching Wrestling with Shadows and go, oh, it fits too well. I can't. But if you were actually around then,
I gotta be honest with Earl, and I love Baby Earl, I think he might be trying to maybe take some of the heat off himself now, because here's the thing, and I'm not trying to tell tales out of school, but I was told that when they interviewed him for this Vice piece, that he had to meet them at a neutral location because he at first didn't believe it was really a TV documentary crew. He thought somebody was trying to set him up and beat him up over what he did 20. I swear, yes. Because it's been a soft spot, or a touchy spot with Earl, because he really was caught between a rock and a hard place, because they snatched him right beforehand and said, hey, you want a fucking job. And he knew he couldn't go in the other direction because there was heat from, the years before when he left to do the twin referee thing. Anyway, and let me ask you this. So back to Bischoff. Bischoff is saying that obviously he offered Bret a contract because Bret signed it and came, but is he saying he didn't offer him a contract earlier in 96?
It was 96, the one he claimed he never offered him the contract in 96. That story, he claimed which was just a total fallacy. He said that Bret Hart and Barry Bloom worked me so he could get a better deal with Vince, which was ludicrous because, as you probably know, and a lot of people know, and it's actually in his book, like Bret and I did not get along. Bret didn't want to talk to me after that. He was told by, a couple of people that were close to him, you're going to have to talk to Dave about this. And he did. The Tuesday after Montreal, we had a long conversation. We ended up being, friends, and pretty good friends. When my mom had a stroke, he was like the first person to reach out and just goes, I heard about your mom, and just remember you've got a friend who, had a stroke and is like the spokesperson for strokes in Canada. So if you ever need anything, but the point is like we, for a variety of reasons, and one of them was that his dad really, and his mom loved the Observer, and he just, for whatever reasons, he thought he was, there's reasons. Bret didn't like me at the time. And Barry Bloom, I know Barry Bloom, but I never talked to Barry Bloom about that business. And again, you were around.
Here's the thing.
Everyone in the business knew the story.
We knew as soon as it happened, because Bret had taken off after WrestleMania. He put Michaels over the Iron Man match, and then he took off to do Lonesome Dove and do acting, and his contract had expired. And also he was waiting to see Michaels twisting in the wind, either a flop at the box office or having a mental meltdown as champion, which that did happen, so that he could come back and say, okay, Vince, you should have known, but I told you so, and here we go, and now we'll do business again. Well, then once again, we heard, because in the writing meetings, and this was before Russo even came along, when it was me and Bruce, that's what Vince said. Well, they've offered Bret pretty close to $3 million per year.
Exactly what the number was.
Yeah. I saw the paperwork because Vince had a copy of it and knew it was legitimate. And that's when Vince came up with the idea, I can't match $3 million a year, but I can sign him for 20 years with good money for a couple of years as a wrestler, and then as a goodwill ambassador and creative something with the company, he'd make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for 20 years. And because Bret wanted to stay loyal, that's what he signed. And then that's what made me start tearing my hair out of my head when in 97, then Russo had come along, and for a while the team was me and Bruce and Russo. And then toward the end of the year, as I mentioned, then Bruce was back in the office and it was just me and Russo. But then Vince is saying, well, I'm going to have to renege on Bret's contract. I'm going to see if he can get the deal back with Bischoff. And my tongue just fucking hit the floor. And that's where they wrote some clause, and Vince was trying to help Bret work Bischoff then, because Vince did say that he didn't want Bret to say that Vince is reneging on the contract. He wanted to say that I have a clause after the first year or whatever. However, they wrote a clause in there that Bret could show Bischoff, saying that I have the power at this time for a 30 or 60 day window or whatever it was to negotiate. Are you still interested? And see if he can get that same deal back. That's exactly what fucking happened. And I don't know how anybody can say it didn't happen, since it was common knowledge at the time.
And the fact that until this last year, for decades, Eric had said the same thing.
Well, it helps when the guy who said one thing
that Eric had
another.
Eric had tried to get Bret. He even said like the one thing that he really tried that he couldn't was get Bret the first time. And I would say 9 wrestlers out of 10 would have gone to WCW in '96 because the money was so much better.
Yeah,
and the travel was better too. So, but Bret, I think that Bret like kind of knew that in WWF he was a legend and he was always going to be, used well. And as even though he had his ups and downs with Vince, I think he always had confidence in Vince, and he didn't know the other side at all. And
and he could kind of smell that they didn't know what they were doing and that they were just spending, a lot of Turner money.
When he got there, it was pretty quick where he figured that out. That they had no direction. I mean, like I can remember pretty quick, kind of like a lot of frustration. I would watch, and I mean, again, when Bret showed up, Bret was the hottest guy in the business when he showed up there, and there were so many mistakes made and impatience and like they would have an idea for 3 weeks and then they would go, this isn't working.
Well, besides, I loved when they showed the footage where the hottest wrestler in the business coming off the hottest, most controversial finish of all time. And they bring him down the aisle to be a special referee. And you could just see him, what the fuck? It was on his face and it was so stupid. And you should have been in on a few of the fucking WWF production meetings at that point when we were scoff laughing at this is what they're doing with the hottest guy in the business that they're paying $3 million a year to. But anyway,
what was so funny was at that time, we go to November 1997, okay, and WCW was winning. WCW's ratings were bigger. WCW was hot. The Hulk Hogan Sting match, you've got to remember, was the month away, and that was the biggest match they would ever do. It was the hottest program they ever had. Hogan Goldberg could have been hotter, but that's another story of, whatever. But it was the hottest match in the history of the company was coming up. They were on fire. And then you guys, WWF, just lost Bret Hart, who was, you could argue there's probably 3 guys, Bret, Shawn, and Undertaker, who were the top 3 guys at the time. And I don't want to say who was bigger, but, I think Bret may have been number 1, maybe some people would, but whatever. They'd lost one of their top guys at a time when they'd already lost Hall and Nash, and Hulk Hogan was there, and so many other guys had switched. And it was like all the momentum. It was like, I thought like, not the death knell of WWE, but I know you would have to at the time be kind of concerned. Like, we lost another top guy to them while we're losing. And I thought like, oh my God, like, Vince is really gonna, I thought like now Vince is actually, cause even when WCW was ahead in 97, I never thought WCW was going to win because I just, Vince had been around for so long, you just don't think. And then at that point I go, Vince may actually lose this fight. I actually kind of was thinking that. Plus the way it all happened because Vince looked so bad. And it's like, how do you trust Vince? But then within 2 months, it was, between WWF had better television and then Tyson came and the DX.
Well, here's the thing. When you think about it, in 3 months, they botched Bret Hart. They botched the Hogan Sting match, so it's Sting never recovered, and we got Tyson. And
Tyson made Austin. Austin was so hot off of that Fresno angle and thing. I remember watching the thing with Austin Tyson going like, okay, it's turned around now because Steve Austin is so freaking hot, like nobody we've ever seen since Hogan. And at that point, it took a couple of months. It didn't happen overnight, but within a couple of months, then the ratings turned around. And by the time the ratings turned around, it was like, there's no going back because these other guys are self-destructing. And the only reason they didn't self-destruct harder in 98 was because Bill Goldberg, they lucked into Bill Goldberg, who got so ridiculously hot. And that was, I love all the people, who claim credit for that because I can tell you, because I was on the conversation, that the Bill Goldberg winning streak and all that stuff, that idea was Mike Tenay.
I was about to say that was the professor, right? That was my brother, the other sharp brother.
Mike Tenay. I've heard 50 people take credit for it. And it's like I was on the phone with Mike Tenay when he calls me up and he just pitches this idea to me, about Bill Goldberg had probably won 30 matches in a row, and Bill was starting to get hot, but he wasn't anywhere close to what he would end up being. Because, Bill's getting hot. How about this idea of a winning streak? And we do it legit, the numbers legit. And he called me up. And the reason he called me up for it was because he wanted me to go through the records. So when they started the next week on TV, the number would be the real number. And so we went back, and whatever the number was the first week they mentioned the streak, that was a real number. And every week it was a real number. And as it got to like 75 or so, and up through 100, Bill was on fire. And, watching Bill do those 2-minute, 90-second squashes, would just boosted the ratings of Nitro, and they were neck and neck with WWF for a while until WWF started taking over. And then they, people will have a different opinion, but I mean, my opinion was they got so carried away, and it's pro wrestling, that they started lying about Bill's number. And people would bring signs because this is already the internet age. So they've got, so people know, like, okay, he worked like 3 house show matches, so his number's higher than 3 from the last one. So they come in and they have the number. And then they start just faking the number. So the signs stopped because those people who would make the signs, like, knew it was fake by this point.
Nothing jive.
Right. And it's like, why do you need, like, you got this thing. This is why it's working, because it was real, so to speak. The number was real anyway. And it's like, why do you then have to make those fans go that you lied? And then they start pumping in the Goldberg stuff in the building, which you didn't have to do because they were doing it anyway. And then you go to the building and they're pumping in the Goldberg, so that makes it fake too. So then Goldberg started getting uncool, and that's when they really started hitting.
Well, and then Hogan wanted to main event to Georgia Dome in front of 40,000 people, and here you go.
Yeah, but that helped actually because Hogan put him over. But then what killed it was that there was never, like, you had Hogan and Goldberg, the hottest match that they ever had, with like, the advance was already like 30,000, and that's why Hogan was, wanted to put him over, was because he could claim credit for that crowd, and the crowd ended up being 41,000 people. And all the execs from Turner were there because wrestling was on fire, and for once they were proud of having a wrestling company because they were selling 41,000 tickets. So all those execs see Hulk Hogan and Bill Goldberg in that main event and just go, my God, Hulk Hogan and Bill Goldberg, we got the greatest thing in the world. So it was great for Hogan, even though he lost.
But then the thing is, he always wanted to get it back, though.
Right. And he would never put Bill over on a pay-per-view. If they would have done like two more pay-per-views, those would have been the 2 biggest pay-per-views in history, but Hogan wouldn't do the second job because he wanted it back. And, that was the beginning of, then the one finger touch with Kevin Nash, and the Kevin Nash with that taser thing. And that's when they just went off a cliff. And that's when, it was,
But we've established that they dropped the ball with Bret and they dropped the ball with Goldberg and etc. But back to Survivor Series, and that, and feel free to tell me if I'm telling a lie, right? Just right here in front of God and everybody, say, JC, you're fucking lying. But you pretty much know, because you're one of the few people that I shared this with. I couldn't remember whether I called you to see if people were still looking for me or not, but you'd already talked to a few people at that point. And before I called you, I think I was down on about number 4 or 5 on the list, maybe past Bruce and a few other people. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I've known him for a long time, but when Bruce says that he didn't regularly talk to Dave, anyway.
Yeah. I wouldn't say all the time, but we definitely talked.
Well, it was more than just at Christmas.
More than just at Christmas, yeah.
But anyway, basically the whole thing, and I have not come out and said a few times over the last few years when I would hear, well, so-and-so wrote a book and they said that it was their idea, and so-and-so wrote a book and said it was their idea. And then idiot, shitstain, he said, oh, well, I just told him to put the hold on. For 2 reasons. Number one, I didn't like Shawn Michaels because he was an unprofessional prick, personally and professionally. And he had no sympathy from me. And I liked Bret, and I liked his brother. I liked his family, and I liked the way he wrestled, and et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't like I was trying to fucking put a hit out on this guy. But as we talked about here on this show last week, I figured, fuck, I'm never going to do a national TV documentary on this thing again. And it's been 20 years. Just to clear it up, the whole incident came about, at least in the way it came about, because I was in the middle of a job that was driving me crazy, listening to millionaires argue with each other about what they were going to do for $2 and $3 million a year. Well, Michaels, the reason why he was arguing a lot, he was only making $750,000, and he was pissed about that because Bret's dick was bigger and his contract too. But I was listening to millionaires argue with each other. I'm sitting across the table looking at fucking Vince Russo. I had already come to the conclusion of what he was and what he was about and how he was, if left to his own devices, was going to hotshot and expose the wrestling business into a goddamn Jerry Springer show. And I was fat and miserable and looking for a way to get out of this whole situation before they drove me crazy. And finally, as people know that I am sometimes want to do, I got cranky when we couldn't do anything done and get anything done. And I said, God damn it, Vince, it's your fucking belt. Take it back, double cross him. And at that point, obviously, and this is the one thing I wanted to clarify with you, and other people have said this, Vince never came up with the finish for seriously. Well, should he cinch up on a small package? It was a sarcastic, well, what's he supposed to do? Cinch up on a small package. Because that's the one he knew from, Wendy and Moon. And I said, no, because then if that's the case, Bret will still kick out and beat the fuck out of him on national TV. And that's when Vince said, well, then how would you do it? Well, now it's a fucking challenge and I'm pissed and we're not getting anything else accomplished here anyway. So I'm going to fantasy book in my head a double cross that would hold water. And so, and I gave credit to Scott Teal, who had just reprinted the Fall Guys. Did you get that, by the way, the wrestling reprints he did of the Fall Guys?
I got Fall Guys. I definitely got the Fall. I had an original copy of the Fall Guys too.
Okay, well, you bastard! I only got my original copy last year from one of the fans who sold it to me for a seduced rate. But Scott had reprinted that, and I'd been reading it, and I went through mentally as quickly as I could on a spur of the moment all of the double crosses I ever knew. And I'd already mentioned, well, sarcastically again, well, fuck it, change the match and book him with Shamrock and he'll lose it. But obviously, no. A, he'd do the same thing that Bearcat Wright did when he saw Judo Gene LaBelle coming and just get out of the ring and we'd be fucked there.
Well,
B,
Ken would never have done that.
Well, Ken wouldn't have done it. They were friends. You couldn't ask two guys to just go into a shoot. And Vince didn't want Ken to win the belt anyway. So I'd already said just in passing.
The funny part of the whole thing is that if Vince came to him with Ken,
he would have done it.
Gladly done the job. That's the funny part of the whole thing. It's like and Austin and I would go so far as to say anyone on the roster, except
anybody,
Shawn.
Probably me, except Shawn. But that's the thing. Vince, I think, mentally had to at least get the belt on who he wanted, because Vince was not wanting to roll over here, right? So he's got that. Right. But anyway, so as a result, I said, okay, there's just a few things that needed to be taken into consideration. You can't do an easy way or hard way like Strangler Lewis because Shawn could not legitimately beat Bret in any way, shape, or form. It wouldn't even have been a contest. So that means you have to have the referee in on it.
You described that clump of hair story, which I knew the story, but I never knew that like Shawn came with a clump of hair.
It was goddamn enormous. Well, it was, and I've said this before publicly. I picked it up and put it in my fucking bag and took it home, and my ex-wife still may have it somewhere in a fucking box somewhere. Because I had to tell the story, right? I had the goddamn visual aid. I said, look at what happened tonight in Hartford.
Yeah.
But anyway, I said, so that means the referee has to be in on it. And what the famous deal with Lewis and Henry DeGlane, where the referee was in on it because he was in fucking, was it, oh my God, it was Paul Bowser at that point, right? Or was he the one they were trying to get it away from?
Paul Bowser would have been the promoter in Montreal when that happened, yeah.
Yeah, so, but anyway, the referee was in on it. And that's how they double-crossed Lewis. Shawn Michaels has no submission holes. Wait a minute. This is an old as the hill spot. The fucking heel gets the goddamn babyface's hold on him, but the babyface powers out and reverses it so quickly because I didn't have much time because they weren't going to listen to me. And like I said, we were getting nothing else done. That's why I said, all right, fucking figure out a spot where Shawn gets the fucking sharpshooter so Bret can reverse it. But the reversal never comes. But in the days before tap out, you relied on the referee. If the guy submitting didn't want to really do it, he wouldn't make that big up and down yes head shake, and the referee would just call it. But this is the main reason. To be honest, I liked Bret. I didn't want people to think I screwed Bret, and I didn't. Vince did. But the reason why I've held this back so long is because, much like, as I said, when we found out that my fucking fan club president was responsible for Vince Russo getting in the wrestling business with John Arezzi.
Was that Andrew Goldberger?
Andrew Goldberger, yes. He said, I know a guy with a video store that'd be glad to sponsor your fucking radio show.
You know what's so funny is I didn't know this story until 3 weeks ago about the Andrew. I mean, I knew the John Arezzi and
I didn't know it until we talked to John about 6 months ago.
Right.
And but anyway, you know,
Andrew Gold. I was at a show in New York at the Hilton. WrestleMania week.
Yeah.
And Andrew Goldberger comes up to me and tells me the story. And I knew Andrew Goldberger; he was a subscriber. But I mean, and he just goes through the story. Like I knew the basics, but I go, oh my God. Like he went through, the story, but it was like, wow, that's the first I'd actually heard of that story.
But much as that, I have been ashamed. I was ashamed for a long time. Now things have gone to such shit, it doesn't really matter anyway. But me, of all people, I figured the fucking finish that did more to expose the wrestling business as a work than anything else in modern history, when you think about it.
Yeah.
And I was like, what the fuck? But anyway, when I pitched that, and I said, then just have the fucking referee ring the bell and everybody get out of there. And what's Bret going to do? Call the newspapers? Nobody will know. Cut the fucking broadcast, blah, blah, blah. Vince went completely the other way. He went out there and made sure everybody saw him calling for the bell. He fucking, not only that, but and a lot of people have said, well, why did they stay on the air? Because, and you know this, tell me if
the air pretty quick.
Well,
they rushed off the air pretty quick.
But they didn't rush off as quick as they could. And I don't know to whether Vince might have told Kevin Dunn, whatever happens, just shoot it. Because he figured there's going to be some kind of chaos. I mean, he wouldn't shoot it if the guy's dick came out of his tights or whatever, but that may have explained that. The clip that Hall referred to where they zoomed in on Vince with the glob of Bret's spit on his face was not from the WWF broadcast.
It
was from the
Shadows.
Exactly. It was from the documentary crew, and they were going to do that.
When the Hall thing, when he goes through that, I go like, wait a minute. That's from Wrestling with Shadows, and the WCW thing, that's also from Wrestling with Shadows. None of that was shot by WWE. So it's like the whole, I think that the one thing, and like I said before, like with this week, and it's not fans, because fans are going to, say whatever they think, but like people in the business that thought that still like come to the idea that this was a work. It's just weird to me because number one, it's one of the most famous stories ever. And number two, it's like, I don't know. It's just weird to me that you could be that wrong on something where there's so much evidence and
I think some of them are like the flat earth people. They fucking know that's bullshit, but they get attention saying it. Right. And then again, some people voted for Donald Trump. So we know that there are people without functioning brain cells that could think this, but anyway, that's the issue. Then that's all I knew. And I still to this day don't know who else. We obviously we know that Vince relayed that spot somehow, and then that's the thing. And he just went harumph, and we went back to our business, and that was Wednesday, and I never heard anything about it again.
Patterson was the one who suggested the spot to Bret.
Well, but that's why I'm thinking Vince, I'm sure relayed that, but I've always thought Pat dealt with the boys. The boys loved Pat. He had a lot of credibility. I don't think Vince wanted to put Pat in that position, but since he was always the agent for the title matches, I would be willing to believe that Vince went to Pat and said, well, we're going to do this DQ or this schmoz or whatever, but at least let's get this spot in and that spot in or whatever. And I believe he may have protected Pat. I don't think that Pat knew what was going on.
I tend to believe that. that Pat didn't know, but I don't. Pat's one I don't know, but I think like really as far as like who knew, I think I'm sure he kept it small. I think it was Shawn, Earl and Dave Hebner at the last minute, and literally last minute. And Jerry Briscoe, obviously. I mean, that's historically, he absolutely knew. But that may have been it. I don't even know if Slaughter knew. I think maybe Slaughter knew by the end, but I don't know.
Did China know? Did Joni Lauer know? No, really. She was with them. She was riding with them.
Triple H knew. Okay, Triple H knew because it was Shawn. I don't know if she knew. I know she said she didn't know, but I don't know.
Well, and here's the thing.
I can tell you that Bret believed she didn't know, and Bret, in his own way, wanted to know who knew and who didn't know. And Bret's list was probably the same as the ones I said. Where he knew Shawn knew, and he knew Shawn knew right away.
Sometime between
and he knew Triple H knew, which is that famous scene in Wrestling with Shadows with Julie Hart with Triple H, which is an absolutely amazing scene.
Yeah, don't give me that bullshit. You knew.
I mean, and he's looking down, and it's just like when I saw that, that's when it's like, wow, he really, because I didn't know that he knew, and later I found out he did because of the conversation, that actually in many ways led to what happened. Because I do actually want to say this story because it's always, and I wished it was in the thing, and it's the one part of the story that always seems to get forgotten, and I know happened was during this week where Vince is coming up with, and he comes up with finish after finish trying to get Bret to lose to Shawn, and Bret's just like, I'll lose to anyone, let me get out of Canada, and I don't want to lose to Shawn. Okay. So Vince goes to Bret once and just goes, if Shawn loses to you in Montreal, if Shawn puts you over in Montreal, will you put Shawn over after Montreal? And Bret was absolutely not a problem. Because I remember actually, what was it? There was somebody who knew that kind of tipped me off before Montreal and goes, you're not going to believe, but Shawn's actually going to lose. And then like a day later was like, oh, I don't know what's happening now. Because Vince came to him with Bret to that. And it wasn't from Bret, but it was someone who knew Bret.
Yeah.
But it was like Vince came to Bret with that idea of, Shawn will lose in Montreal, and if Shawn puts Bret over first, is Bret going to put him over? Bret's a pro, really. Of course he is. And then he went to Shawn and Shawn, and it was Shawn and Paul, Triple H. And Shawn, this is Shawn's, and has on an RF video was kind of blindsided, like, did this happen? And he got all nervous, and then he admitted it, that it did. And he said that Triple H said, he's leaving the company, don't you ever put him over. And Shawn refused to put him over.
And by the way, this fucking guy is 1 year removed from not winning the King of the Ring because he fucking fell in with his other clique buddies and exposed the business in Madison Square Garden. And now he feels like he's goddamn able and capable of giving the fucking world champion, such as he was and Shawn's mindset at the time, advice on something this major. He's always been a fucking social climber in the locker room, hadn't he?
But it's amazing where he's turned out.
Well, it's amazing where he climbed to, but Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. But, he's like, one of the most powerful guys in the business and set up this whole NXT thing. And I mean, his influence on the business is so absolutely gigantic. But the whole thing is like, so he was like, he's leaving. Don't put him over. And Shawn's like, I'm not going to put him over. So then Vince has to go back to Bret and go, Shawn won't put you over again. So at this point, like, there's not a chance in hell Bret's going to put Shawn over. I mean, like, because this is the one thing where, like, people will talk to me about, like, oh, I can't believe Bret did this. And I kept thinking, and I actually brought it up to Lou Thez once. And, imagine, okay, I said, Lou, imagine that some guy, and he's good. That's some guy, whatever, goes, I'll never put you over, Lou. Like, and it's your time to drop the world's championship. And he just goes, not a chance. Or Bruno. I never brought up with Bruno. But it's like, do you think for a heartbeat that some guy goes up to Bruno Sammartino, let's say Ivan Koloff, since that's the guy I lost to, and Ivan goes, thank you, Bruno, for losing, but, if they ask me to lose to you, I will never lose to you. Like, Bruno's going, fuck you, you're never getting the title over my dead body, right? So it's like, that's the thing. Like,
well, Thez proved that with Buddy Rogers. That one remark in 1946, Rogers won the title from Pat O'Connor in 1961. that one remark.
Luthez was asked to drop the title to Buddy Rogers, and it was just like, there's not a chance. And then part of it was also because Buddy Rogers wasn't a real wrestler. And Lou wanted to lose to Gordienko, who was real, but they couldn't get him in the country. So then he went with Hutton, who, was a fantastic actual wrestler, but the whole thing is like, Lou, there was one remark that Buddy Rogers made. He called Lewis, Strangler Lewis, who was Lou's idol, whatever. I mean, Lou's childhood idol was Strangler Lewis, and he calls him a fat bastard. Why do we have to cut him in on, a percentage of our main event gate at some city and
Evansville? They were on the way from Louisville. Me and John Cosper tracked the exact date down.
Wow.
It's in Tuesday night at the Gardens. But anyway, back to let's go to the culprits list, because I'm clearing Pat Patterson. I'm saying, okay, Pat didn't know. Because once again, this conversation, it was me, Vince McMahon, Vince Russo at Vince's house on Wednesday. I never spoke to any of them again until Saturday. On Saturday at the production meeting, which you had written in the Observer, but it was not a meeting just with me, Jim Ross, Shawn Michaels, and a few other people that were listed. It was the normal pay-per-view production meeting that took place the night before, and Michaels came in and sat in on it, which was at the time unusual, but not the first ever, right? So, okay. And what I had asked Vince on the way out, when we got to the main event, said, okay, music, match, music on out. Good night. That's the way they just, normally we'd go over the finish, whose music was playing, whatever, but in that case, that's the way they did it. Good night, everybody. Broke up the meeting. I went by Vince and just leaned over. I said, have you got a finish? And he said, yes. I said, that's all I need to know. And I left. And we found out that Shawn Michaels and Jerry Briscoe went to the fucking hotel room, and Jerry tried to make Shawn Carl Gotch in a fucking night in a hotel room. So they knew. Triple H knew, because Shawn, not an idiot, also knew that Triple H was actually bigger and in a lot better shape and probably could take care of himself. So if somebody was going to kick Shawn Michaels' ass, then he'd have his buddy there. So Triple H knew. Who knows whether China knew, and who cares at this point anyway? Vince McMahon knew. I don't think Bruce knew, because once again, plausible deniability.
Bruce is always denied, and
But you can't believe anything. You can't believe anything Bruce says. But I don't think he knew, because he didn't need to know. And at the gorilla position, he would have been there with all the boys, and he's not that good of an actor, so he really was shocked.
Yeah. And
I don't know whether Slaughter knew or whether Vince just said, Sarge, come on out. We're going to do some business. Need you. I want you there just in case. Because, Sarge at that point wouldn't have cared. If somebody come at Vince, Sarge would have took care of it. He didn't care what was going on. So Slaughter's a question mark. And none of the production crew had to be alerted, except for I can believe that Vince would have said to Kevin Dunn, whatever happens, pal, just shoot it until we did get it done, or something like that.
You got to keep you see, the thing is, they had to keep the number down, because the key is that Bret had a lot of friends.
Yeah.
And if it got back to Bret, the whole idea would be foiled.
And we know also that of the people that knew, Triple H has said he came up with the spot. Well, that's ridiculous, because I'd come up with the spot the previous Wednesday, but I guess he wanted to get in on the thing. And I'm sure the double cross came across everybody's mind, because we were all in the wrestling business. So that's something you would think about. But that particular spot, no. We can count Russo out, because he didn't know what a fucking double cross was to begin with. He sat there and looked at us with a blank look, and there would have been no reason for Vince to tell him that it was going to happen. So, and we also know that he's a shameless bandwagon hopper on her. So I'm pretty sure he didn't know. So looking back, I can't figure out anybody else in the company that would have needed to know and would have been told, besides Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Jerry Briscoe, and possibly Sergeant Slaughter.
Yeah, I think the same. What?
I'm just saying, can you? Yeah, and that's how it worked.
No,
I'm saying, can you think of anyone else?
Yeah. No, that would have been the list that I would have come up with. You know, Slaughter's the one that I don't know, and the other ones for sure knew, and they would probably have been the only ones.
So, and that's, you know, and that's how you pull off a fucking surprise or a double cross or anything else in the wrestling business, is you don't tell every fucking body in the world and put it on all your formats.
Right.
But it should have been, actually, in hindsight, my thing was do it like a real double cross like they used to where the fans won't know and it won't break kayfabe and get the fuck out of there. Vince went the complete other way with it and instead made it plain to pretty much to everybody what they were doing. But everybody still should have come out better. And of course, then Vince, here's the thing. He, remember, for what was it, a week, 2 weeks, he thought he was going to be the babyface. He tried the promo, the time-honored tradition to shame Bret. He couldn't figure out that he was not going to be the babyface for the first week or two.
Yeah. The other one that I remember, because I knew about this ahead of time, I don't remember who told me, but they mentioned, you know, I guess the promo had been taped, but it hadn't aired. Okay, so because it wasn't done live on Raw, and it's like Vince is doing this promo, and I was kind of told, you know, it's like he's going to make Bret the heel, you know, because Bret wouldn't do the job and all that, and I was like, Bret's coming off pretty sympathetic anyway, number one, but the one line was Vince was going to say that if this was the punch, if it was a fair fight, the ending would have been different, and I was just like, he can't say that. Like, it's like, I don't care who would win a fight between Bret and Vince, and it doesn't matter, okay? But the people do not want to hear that, you know, even though Vince is big and in shape and all that, they do not want to hear that the 52-year-old promoter could beat the world champion. If it was a prelim guy, fine, you know, but not the world champion, and not Bret, who'd been like a top guy in that company for years and years, who the fans really wanted to believe in, you know what I mean? As you know, and he'd been portrayed as a top guy. You don't want to say that, because unlike today where it really wouldn't matter one iota, even as late as the 90s, the people did want to believe that the wrestlers were tough guys. Like,
well, yeah, and besides that, let's be honest, Bret could still whip fucking Vince McMahon in 1997, for God's sake. You know, I mean, just...
Yeah, But why do you even have to? Why do you even have to say that? And I thought, as soon as he says that, number one, you know, for me, about people say this, but it exposes your business and your world champion. You're telling the people that you're saying that your world champion's not really a tough guy, and the people. It exposed his ego.
It exposed his ego, is what it did.
And I go like, he can't say that, and it's like, well, who's going to tell him he can't, right? But I remember, and then I watched it, and I go like, I can't believe that he said that. You know,
I saw it. I can't remember whether I was either at the studio when they shot it or I was at the studio when they were watching it back right after they shot it. And that's the thing, that the time-honored tradition business gave me horrible stomach aches. The whole idea of trying to not say do a job, but this is basically, I'm saying, my God, they're going the wrong way with this. They're telling everybody. And yet, Vince McMahon was the greatest heel performer of all time on television as a personality, as a character, as the kids say these days. But unfortunately, and he could have done that in any era and didn't have to expose the business. But unfortunately, this was the start of exposing the business, letting people behind the scenes, like I said, the work shoot and the shoot work that's just so garbage, because now by inference, by extrapolation, by whatever, well, this is a real shoot going on now, and it's not like everything else we do, which is a work. Then you've just exposed the business. And then every time now you tell people, well, this is real as opposed to being a work, but the fucking shoot is a work that we find out later on, then it killed everybody's credibility. This was the start of I know the Attitude Era was already going on, but this was the start of the downfall of the business, in large part because now that Russo's going to hot shot everything and make everything Jerry Springer and just do everything that can possibly be done. But at the same time over here, we're telling everybody that it's all a fucking work and the behind the scenes shit's the only real stuff. That's why since 2001, once they finally punctured a hole in Stone Cold Steve Austin and people couldn't believe him anymore, and WCW folded up and all the traditional fans just said, well, fuck it. We've never recovered. But anyway, we do have a couple of follow-up things on our episodes the last few weeks on I can't say the word screw job with a straight face. We've explained that that's not even a wrestling word, right?
No, we've never actually discussed the origin of screw job as it was applied to Montreal on the show.
What Montreal was a double cross. Screw job is a term that a lot of the emerging smart wrestling fans of the 80s and the newsletters of the 80s kind of popularized. Because in the old days, if it was, if the booker was to give you a finish and you were going to beat the babyface, use some type of dirty tactic, you'd say, yeah, you hit him with a fuck finish, fuck the babyface. And so then some of the more prudish and less, vulgar wrestling bookers, I'm sure there's one or two somewhere, might say screw the baby face or whatever, but a fuck finish was everybody was working and everybody was in on it, but you cheated to win. That was a fuck finish, or you screwed the baby face. That was that was what that was. A double cross is completely different. It's a double cross, but for some reason, the Montreal screw job was attached to it because I guess Bret screwed Bret and all that screwiness going on. But it's not really a screw job because it wasn't a fuck finish. It was a double cross. So the Montreal double cross shows we did. There's a cut. Then we had Meltzer on and we talked of the follow up on Dark Side of the Ring. I have a follow up on. Let me figure out how to phrase it. Right. Okay. When last we left, I'll sound like the narrator on Lost in Space. When last we left the Hart family, Bret had walked out after getting double crossed. And Bret was gone. And I remember a writing day about 2 or 3 weeks later when Vince was telling me, and I'm going to use the name Russo instead of Shitstain every time, just in case any of our new listeners don't know who Shitstain is. It's Vince Russo. I'll use his names, keep this story clear. I remember Vince McMahon telling Vince Russo and I, we've got legal sending Bret a letter. Because they had their legal department send Bret a letter because Bret had been trying to talk Owen into leaving the WWF and coming with him to WCW. And I remember Vince saying that legal was sending him a letter. And I thought, well, I can understand why he's doing this, but right, you couldn't really say anything to Vince at that point. And of course, there's Russo going, yeah, that's right. It was tortuous. A tort, like a legal tortuous interference with Owen's contract that they threatened Bret with a lawsuit for trying to talk his brother into after they double crossed him into coming with him, right? Well, I remembered that side of the story, but it wasn't until Meltzer and I were comparing notes on both sides of the situation. Bret Hart, guess who told apparently Vince McMahon and Titan Sports that Bret Hart was tortuously interfering with his brother? Vince Russo. Because a couple weeks after the fucking Montreal deal, Vince Russo calls Bret up. And he's acting like he's his good friend and he's sympathizing with him. And, oh, man, I can't believe they did what they did and there had to be another way or whatever. So then in the conversation, Bret brings up that he wants Owen out of there. He was trying to get him to come to WCW because, and we'll talk about Davey in a second. And then Russo, as Reggie B. Fine used to say on Memphis TV, then immediately delayed the information back to Vince McMahon, who then threatened to sue Bret for tortuously interfering with his own brother.
Why did Vince want to keep Owen so badly, considering the way everything went?
Well, hold on, and I'm about to tell you that too. As a matter of fact, this is not something that just suddenly was a repressed memory. Bret had actually told Dave Meltzer the next day how Russo buddied up to him, acted like he was his friend, and then he let his guard down and mentioned trying to get Owen out of there, and it got the legal papers. Bam, right? But then with Davey Boy, because he was a member of the family too, but Davey, let's just say Davey at the time had some personal issues that I had seen him exhibit over the period of time where they were like, okay, if we're going to let one of them go, we're going to let Davey go. They made him pay $150,000 to get out, to buy his way out. He had like a fucking 4-year contract. So they let him buy it out for $150,000 to get out of his contract to go take a deal with WCW, where he got a guaranteed deal for several $100,000. Obviously, I don't know how much he was making there, but it was a good big time deal. But then that's when he got injured. Not long after. He wasn't in WCW. How long was it?
Oh, it was short. It was a short period of time.
And wasn't that the trapdoor deal?
It was, I think, the trapdoor for the Ultimate Warrior to magically appear in the ring. And Davey took a backdrop onto it.
This fucking knucklehead, fucking idiot goof Ultimate Warrior that once again Hogan was trying to get a fucking job out of and get use out of in some kind of way. They have a trapdoor built into the ring so that he can crawl through the ring and do whatever the fuck he's going to do. And Davey takes a bump on the handle of it. Like they've got a handle and I don't know what the fuck anyway. And so he fucked his back up and he was pretty much done. So they fucked up Davey Boy's career. But here was the thing. Vince kept Owen because Vince wanted to make Owen the Canadian hero. And me and Dave touched on this a little bit, but it bears repeating. Obviously, since you didn't pay any attention. Vince immediately tore up Owen's $250,000 a year contract and gave him one for $400,000 because he knew that Owen, a big deal, was providing for his family. And Owen wanted that guaranteed security in a place he was already in and at least kind of halfway knew what he was dealing with. And $150,000 a year raise for a couple of years, however long the term was. And Vince even told us right at the beginning there, yeah, Owen's going to be our Canadian hero. I think he wanted to replace Bret and show that, well, it's my promotional machine, right? And also that way he could pay back the Hart family in his mind. And he wanted him to work with, and if you'll recall, when Owen came back, it was a run-in on Shawn Michaels at the next month's pay-per-view. And then they had a match in Richmond on a Raw where Michaels, playing off the concussion he'd had. No, that was after. That was years earlier. But anyway, it was a deal that Owen was going to work against Shawn and be in the title picture and in the mix and everything. And by the time that fucking Shawn and the rest of his buddies finished burying him and coming up with the nugget shit, the piece of shit that won't quite flush. We flushed Bret, but his little brother, they made him so secondary and played up the little brother thing so much and made it so silly that nobody was taking Owen seriously. And they eventually and he wasn't going to fucking do any jobs to Owen. So eventually they got that push cut off. So Owen was making that guaranteed money. But that's over the next year, they had him they wanted him to have an affair with Deborah, which he didn't want to do because his kids were in school. And so then they did the Blue Blazer thing because he didn't want to say no because they're paying him all this money, but he wasn't the main event fucking Canadian hero and challenger to Shawn Michaels that he was supposed to be. He was fucking mid-card guy because they buried him and they talked Vince out of it. So that's what happened. Oh, and then Owen. So they fucking, here's the thing when you think about this, they fucking buried Bret in WCW and then he got the concussion. So he was pretty much done. And they made Davey buy his way out of his contract and he went to WCW and their negligence hurt him. And Owen
Did Neidhart have to buy out too?
No, they just let him go. That was fine. And then with Owen, they want to keep him and make him a star and they give him a big raise. But then the fucking, Billionaire Boys Club of WWF, the Clique, buries him too. And they end up making him a mid-card guy. And he's up in the rafters in Kemper Arena. And there went Owen. So the wrestling business managed to botch up their entire family. 3 of the most talented wrestlers in the fucking history of the world in 18 months. Just being stupid.
What was it like for Owen after Bret left? Because obviously I'm assuming that he would spend most of his time at the arenas with either Bret or Davey or Jim or Pillman, who had been alive a month earlier. So when he comes back And Bret's gone and Neidhart's gone and Davey Boy's gone. Who is Owen mostly spending his time with?
He was friends with Jeff Jarrett. He really was. And I know he rode with me a couple times. See, I wasn't on the road full time. I was going in and out for TV. So, I'm not sure who all his writing group was. He rode with me a few times in between TVs, but I think he rode a lot with Jeff and Deborah. But it wasn't the same. And he told me flat out, he's like, I'm making money for my family. On one of the trips that we took, he was saving up because he mentioned, I think, didn't he want to be a firefighter because he was taking or going to take courses. He already had an idea that maybe however long this was going to last, wrestling, where he was still in his early 30s, 5 years or whatever the big contract was, and then he would have a backup plan and to live at home in Calgary.
His brother's a firefighter, right, Keith?
Well, there you go. Yes, I think that's what it was, and also, but anyway, so that was really fucked up enough. But here's also, once again, for these nitwits, this is another piece of information for these nitwits who think that it's still a work or trying to say it was a work. They had depositions on both sides. The WWE sued to shut down Wrestling with Shadows, and they gave depositions. Bret looked into suing the WWE for breach of his creative control clause, breach of contract, but how can you win monetary damages for hurting your career in front of a jury when, number one, it's wrestling, and number two, you left a job where you were making $1.5 million a year and now you've made $2.5 million. That would have never passed a jury because they wouldn't have fucking got it. But and then Vince threatened to countersue. If Bret sued for breach of fucking contract, then Vince would countersue for assault and damage to the equipment. So all these fucking depositions and all these lawyers involved, they're going that far for a work when Vince McMahon has never gone that far. Even the stuff that he wanted people to believe was a fucking, it doesn't make any sense, right? So that's that. I just wanted to clear those things. But yes, Vince Russo strikes again. He was the one, as 20 years later, when we're all comparing notes about what we were hearing from different sources at the time, Shitstain strikes again, stabbing somebody in the back. But I'm surprised he wasn't like, Brody, mi amigo, por favor. I'm surprised it wasn't Vince Russo.
Do you remember how long it was after Montreal that you guys found out that Bret was mic'd by Wrestling with Shadows for that conversation with Vince earlier in the day at Montreal?
I don't remember when I learned that very thing because I wasn't on the creative team that much longer. And as a matter of fact, we can go into that while we still have time in this program. One more thing before we go. I have my book out again because, as we all know, Montreal was November 9th, 1997. And then, as we all know, I left and bailed the fuck out of there quickly. So the next day, I sneak in, wondering if anybody's wanting to beat me up, right? And everybody looks at me normal, so I'm like, okay, I'm covered so far. And that's when we have the production meeting, because that's a Raw taping in Ottawa, Ontario. And obviously, Bret was not there. Obviously, nobody ever expected Owen or Davey to come either, right? Because they're family. Vince didn't, and there wasn't even heat on them for not coming. That was an understood thing that was probably going to happen. That's when, out of loyalty and indignation, Mick Foley did not come to TV and sent word that he would not be there because he was offended that Vince did that to one of the boys.
Were there any stories yet about what Rick Rude was thinking? Obviously, this is before he made his jump.
I don't recall exactly. Rick Rude may have been thinking I'm fucking out of this fucking lunatic asylum anyway soon. I don't know. But so they asked me, because I'd had the longest relationship with Cactus. They asked me to call him that night when I called him when I got back to the hotel and asked him to come the next day. He didn't leave the country. He did not come to TV as protest. And I felt, now here's the thing. I felt bad because, like, okay, as we've already mentioned, and I don't need to beat it up anymore, but the spot was my spot. And now I'm trying to and Cactus is mad at Vince McMahon for doing something I suggested to do. Oh, I'm like, fuck. But at the same time, and I say this in public, I presented him with this. Cactus, come and tell Vince how you feel in person, because Undertaker did. Undertaker let him have it. And, you know, he heard from a few of the boys. But I said, come and tell Vince in person how you feel about it and make your feelings known. Nobody's saying you shouldn't do that. But to not come back to work and risk your employment, the Foleys have kids. And Bret's fixing to leave a job where he's making $1.5 million, and he's going to go make $2.5 million. Is he going to pay the Foleys' bills? Which was basically for real. I mean, it was right for him to be indignant, but it wasn't fair for him to penalize him. If all the boys had a fucking staged a group walkout, well, maybe then we'd have a union. Who knows? But it wasn't fair for Mick to. I've always said it. He's too nice. He's too nice being a wrestler. If Mick Foley and Bobby Eaton were roommates for 3 months, if they moved out and away from each other, Bobby would have everything Mick owned, and Mick would have everything Bobby owned. They're too nice. But anyway, so we got Cactus to come back to TV the next day in Cornwall, Ontario. As I recall, it should have been named Cornhole, but that's a different story. But then the following week, when everybody got back and got settled fucking down and realized, that's when we talked about Vince thought he was going to be the babyface. He's at the studio. He cut the interviews, the time-honored tradition and all that stuff, and quickly realized he was not going to be. And I think it wasn't maybe past that following weekend. Wasn't he just doing that? Like it only lasted maybe 1 week on TV. Maybe it was 2 that he was thinking he was going to be the babyface. But pretty soon he realized that this was turning against him. And once again, Russo was right there right now with all of this, because this was his dream come true. It's real drama and horseshit. He can really fuck this wrestling stuff. Now I can write this shit like the Jerry Springer Show and win a fucking daytime Emmy or whatever the fuck he was, or just do he called it Crash TV, but what it was trash TV. That's where he got the idea. He changed one letter of a word like he did with most everything, and then took credit for it. He was wanting to do trash TV. He was salivating, and here was his chance. Here's all this fucking drama and all this chaos. And now Vince doesn't know which way to go. Yes, Vince McMahon, the evil Mr. McMahon, is the greatest heel character in the history of television. But what this did was it also opened the door for all this fucking Jerry Springer bullshit that we would have to fucking look at and listen to for the next, 2 years. So anyway, the weekend of right before Thanksgiving, it was a weekend of house shows. Richmond, Virginia, Greensboro, North Carolina, Hampton, Virginia, and then the TV's Raw tapings were in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Roanoke, Virginia on November 24th and 25th. And that was really the first TV tapings that we had done since the set in Montreal or in Canada after the incident that had already pretty much been established everything. So here was the new direction starting, because now Vince is like, okay, I want to be heel, blah, blah, blah. I remember this because do you remember, you watched Raw back in those days. Do you remember the Stone Cold Steve Austin pickup truck?
Yeah.
I drove the Stone Cold Steve Austin. No, here's the thing. They were going to take it to, I know it was these TVs, because then I went home. I brought it home with me. They were going to take the goddamn Stone Cold Steve Austin, hell yeah, Austin 316, 100% whoop ass, black pickup truck to TV, but they were going to put it in a truck and haul it or whatever the fuck. And they knew I was driving because it was Thanksgiving. I was going to make the TVs and then come home to Louisville, right? So they said, you want to drive the pickup truck? I said, sure. So I drove from Stamford, Connecticut, all the way down to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Roanoke, Virginia. And that's where you've seen that picture of me and Tommy Noe and Brian Hildebrand in the back of the truck. I drove then from Roanoke down to the Tri-Cities to visit Brian, because that's when he had gotten sick first, I believe. And we had that picture taken. And then I drove on home for Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving weekend. So I had the fucking Stone Cold truck with me. You get some looks when you're getting gas in that thing, right? And that's the weekend that I ran into Danny Davis at our favorite fish place, Clarksville Seafood. And he invited me over and showed me the OVW, the old place over in Jeffersonville. It was a goddamn hole in the wall, but he told me what he was doing with it and what he was making out of it and how he was doing everything himself and that he had the contract with the gardens and a little local 30-minute TV, the whole 9 yards, right? So automatically my wheels have started turning because I've gone, as I mentioned on the previous shows, October, Pillman passes away. 3 weeks later, whatever it is, there's goddamn Montreal bullshit. All is sitting in the room with fucking Russo and Vince McMahon every fucking week, listening to that goddamn. And now he's worse than ever because he's pitching all this fucking Jerry Springer shit. And my weight is enormous because I'm aggravation eating. So I weighed 278 pounds that weekend when I got back to Connecticut. That's the most I've ever weighed in my life. And I started thinking about an escape strategy of coming and partnering with Danny Davis and promoting wrestling in Louisville. Whether or not the WWF was involved in it remained to be seen, right? But that's someplace I can go whenever I can. I've had all I can stands. I can't stands no more. So we get back, and now it's December, and we do the Springfield, Massachusetts In Your House pay-per-view that was originally going to be, remember the 30-day extension that Bret was allowed to have where he could come and drop the title then?
That's right, yeah.
Well, that's where it was going to be. It ended up being Shamrock and Shawn Michaels. And once again, in a goddamn coincidence, I said, well, change the title of Boogie with Shamrock. He'll fucking lose there. Change the match of Boogie with Shamrock. He'll lose the title, right? Well, they booked Shawn against Shamrock, but they don't want him to shoot on him. So that's a shame. Anyway, so basically Thursday the 4th Wednesday the 3rd of December would have been our writing day. And, whatever the fuck we got set for the In Your House in Springfield. And then the next day in Portland, Maine was a Raw taping. And the next day in Durham, North Carolina, Durham, New Hampshire was another Raw taping. So we were doing 3 days of television in a row because it's coming up on the holidays. And, for various reasons, including cost cutting, they used to stock up in those days on TV so you didn't have to do it over Christmas time. But then I remember that same week, instead of a house show in Lowell, Massachusetts on Thursday the 11th, they added a Shotgun Saturday Night and Raw taping. The Raw would air December 22nd, so that way they could get away from Christmas. So here is what led to me leaving the creative team, and I'm going to dispel another rumor here when I get there. That week, I find out not only we're going up Saturday night to Springfield, Massachusetts, we're doing the pay-per-view on the 7th. We're doing Raw in Portland on the 8th, Raw in Durham on the 9th. Then on the 10th, we're going to be off. There's a house show, but the TV crew, the creative team, we don't have to go there. But then we're going to be in Lowell, Massachusetts, literally like 50 miles away from Durham or whatever, on the Thursday. But yet, Vince has still scheduled a writing day in fucking Greenwich for Wednesday the 10th. So we'll have to drive back from Durham, New Hampshire to our homes, leave about fucking 8 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, go down to Vince's, sit there all day, and then drive back up 200 miles fucking Lowell, Massachusetts. So I had an idea. And on Friday the 5th, I believe it was, because that's the last day I would have been able to really call and ask, right? I pitched an idea before I went on this weekend trip. I called Beth, Vince's personal secretary. She's the gatekeeper, right? If you needed to ask Vince a question or in any way communicate with Vince, you always call Beth and she got your answer. I said, Beth, I got an idea. I said, this situation next week with the travel. I said, how about for the 1 week, I'll stay up there. And because Vince Russo has a family. He's got kids. Let him come back and spend some time with his kids and do the meeting on Wednesday. I'll stay up there and I'll cover the TV in Lowell and he don't have to come. And that way he can have an extra day home with his family and it'll save company expenses and all that stuff, right? Because I'm like, fuck, I got to fucking get out of this goddamn somewhere or another because I'm going to choke somebody if I have to make this fucking trip. She says, I'll let you know. And she called back and said, that sounds good. Okay, great, right? So I do that. And then, of course, Russo being the fucking little kiss-ass suck-up that he was, he ended up going back, and he came back to Lowell anyway. I remember that, even though I offered him to cover for him. But from his own little chicken lips, from his own little weaselly lips, he has said, well, I just got Vince alone, and I told him, hey, it just doesn't work with me and Cornette. You know, there's so much arguing and bickering and blah, blah, blah. We can't get anything done. The day that I offered to leave him home with his little howl at the moon kids and his long-suffering wife so that he could have some home time and I could stay up there and avoid that drive, that's when he fucking bit me in the ass and went behind my back. Because that would be the time where he was alone with Vince. But you will also notice and I should say the punchline of this whole thing is, when I get back after Lowell, right, I'm pretty sure we didn't go to the office on Friday because that was a pretty long trip. So the next week, on Monday, that's when I would have called and said, hey, what's the schedule for this week? And that's when Beth told me, well, Vince doesn't need you Wednesday. He said he'll call you the next time you're needed. Excellent. I'll be waiting for that phone call.
Did you know what that meant right away?
I was hoping, but I wasn't sure. And so I said, okay, I'll wait for that phone call. That phone call has still never come. Because here's the thing. What a lot of people don't understand is that they have painted, well, because he also describes it this way. They think that Russo got me fired from a job in the WWF. Not only was I still doing all the other things that I was doing, but my money never changed. You were rotated in and out sometimes in those days. Well, Bruce was there a lot because he was, he kind of blended in and went with the flow of things.
Ass kisser.
But I didn't say ass kisser, but you were rotated on and off the creative team, but that didn't in those days, it was such a small team, 2 or 3 people and Vince, that it didn't mean you were done. For example, I was doing fill-in commentary on those Raws in the Northeast that I just talked about. JR and I did commentary on Raw for those shows because that's when Vince had taken himself off as announcer and before they got their crews set. I was still an agent and producer for matches at television. Hey, here's what we want. Go get with this guy. Tell them how much time they got and produce the match, agent the match, whatever. I was doing regular weekly syndicated commentary on Superstars at the time with JR and doing some of the international programs. Michael Cole had just started, I think, at that point, or maybe hadn't even started yet. But I did, as a matter of fact, it was a trivia note on Twitter. Me and Michael Cole were the announce team for the pilot episode of SmackDown on UPN. That was in '99. So I was doing announcing at the studio and on the programs. I was doing agenting at the television tapings. I was also working with starting to work more often with the local promoters on booking third-party guys and booking the job guys or the enhancement talent so it wasn't like they just said, okay, Cornette, you're done. What this meant to me was that I didn't have to fucking drive to Vince McMahon's house every goddamn Wednesday morning for an hour and a half in that fucking traffic, listen to Vince Russo shit out his fucking mouth for 8 to 10 hours at least, and then drive back in the same amount of fucking traffic and eat myself into a goddamn oblivion. I lost that, and everything else I kind of half-ass enjoyed doing by that point. Of course, I was still living in Connecticut, but I had at least took that off my plate because it's not like that. You don't, I've explained this before. When you're on the creative team, you're not the booker in the WWF. You don't book anything. You book what Vince wants you to book. You pitch ideas. Vince approves the shit at the top. And then maybe you get to fill in the stuff at the bottom under certain parameters, like what's a guy's name and whether he's a babyface or a heel and so other important, pertinent information. It's not something that you have when you're a booker, then the company owner hires you and says, here is the roster that we've got right now. Make any changes you want, bring in whoever you want, kick whoever you want out, format the televisions, book my live cards, and give me all the finishes. That's what the booker does. You don't book for Vince McMahon. Nobody ever has. So it was not like I was losing my precious baby, the book of the WWF to somebody else. No, I just didn't have to listen to this fucking moron ramble on anymore. And it was less work that I had to do for the same amount of money. And it was not enjoyable at that point. It had been somewhat enjoyable a year and a half previously. It had long since welcome had worn off of that aspect of the game. So when Dickhead says, well, he's just mad because Vince chose me over him, my vision. It was still Vince's vision. He was just the one chosen to crawl up Vince's ass and sleep there for a while.
And it didn't cost you any money.
And it didn't cost me any money because I was making the same amount of fucking money. And actually, I'm the one who suggested that I not make that amount of money when a year and a half later, then the following November, to finish up the OVW story, the following November, I planned ahead and went down to Louisville for the Thanksgiving break, where I was able to do Danny's TV on the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving and shoot an angle for a match that we had on the Sunday night house show in the same building, where I got a chance to see his operation and how it worked and meet everybody. And actually, I had a 6-man. It was me and Conway and Rob Conway and Nick Dinsmore against the Andretti brothers and that no good Star Maker Bolin in a 6-man tag match. And that's when I started percolating the real plans for a developmental program, because by that point they had started outgrowing the warehouse in the studio in Stamford, where if they're using a chainsaw or a wood saw to build a set, and the guys are breathing the fucking sawdust, or they're painting something and guys are getting blown up while they're smelling all this fucking paint. And, the people on the TV technical crew on their lunch breaks are standing around watching these guys, Kurt Angle, train. It was so fucking hokey for a company that size. That's why I went to JR when I finally said, okay, we can do this. We can put something together. And in the meantime, Kevin Dunn had split me and JR up from doing announcing because we were both too Southern together. So that was another thing I enjoyed doing that I wouldn't get to do anymore. And finally, I was basically fed up with the whole fucking thing. And so I told JR, I said, look, here's what we can do in terms of a developmental program. We have a school. We have local television. We have live events that we run, the sponsored shows in little small schools around the area. Have a contract with the Louisville Gardens for bigger events because there's nobody going to the Gardens these days. And the best part of it is, if you let me move to Louisville and try this out, you can pay me half what you're paying me now, and I'll take it. And that's how so I cut my own salary to get the fuck out of there. And within 6 months, they'd liked the job we were doing so much, then the salary was back up the same place it had been before.
Would they have gone for it if you hadn't offered to cut your salary?
Possibly, but I wanted to really clinch the fucking thing, because when Vince says no to something one time, it's almost impossible to get a yes the second time. So I was leaving pretty much regardless. I was doing less and less. I was wanting to do less and less, and my rope was about to run out. That's why I told JR right before that we got the word about this. I said, I just want you to know that I am planning to leave Connecticut the first day of July. And if I don't have a job, I'm going to hospitalize Vince Russo my last day here. And he's like, Corny, don't do that. I said, well, I'm hoping everything works out. So maybe a part of it was we can pay him half and he won't fucking break Vince Russo's knees with a baseball bat. But anyway, so that was that. And just going back to December 97 for a minute, I remember basically that December 15th in Little Rock, Arkansas, which would have been pretty much the first week that I was off the goddamn creative team. I believe that's when Shawn Michaels caused the riot in Little Rock, because the people got rowdy and were throwing things. So he decided to just walk out of the whole goddamn show, and they didn't have the main event match, and people set fire to seats and everything. And I'm like, All I have to do now is read the fucking Finkel report, right? I don't have to goddamn hear this in the creative meetings and placate this little fucking prick and all the other people we got a baby and the other knucklehead exposing the business or wanting to do a goddamn cross between Dr. Phil and Jerry Springer every fucking week. I didn't have to fucking deal with any of that. So by Christmas time, 1997, that's when I started my diet. And I started at 278, the end of Thanksgiving weekend. And by July 99, when I moved back to Louisville, I weighed 197, which is the lightest that I'd been until fucking last summer. So
well, you also
it's
100 pounds in a year?
A year and a half from Thanksgiving of 97 to the summer of 99. Don't say almost 100. I lost 81. But yeah, but that's when you are when you figure, life can go on. I can get out of fucking Connecticut.
Yeah.
I can get out of the room with Vince Russo. Then you have a reason to fucking live. And now my reason is I want to continue living because you can be young and fat, but you can't be old and fat. And I'd rather be old than fat. But anyway, that's the aftermath with the Hart Foundation of Montreal. That's the aftermath with me. That's the aftermath with me and Shitstain and how we parted company there. Well, I still had to deal with him at the TVs, but I didn't have to sit in a room with him every Wednesday. And by the way, he identified himself. Let me just tell you another time when he believes this shit now. I can't even say another time that he's lying because in his head, in his mind, he really remembers it this way. But he said on the Dark Side of the Ring, I was the head writer for the WWE during the Montreal screw job. Now, at one point, when they changed things after 99, when I came back to Louisville, or somewhere around that time, now he was the head writer and Ferrara, they did give him a title. But in 1997, there was no such title or job as head writer in the WWF. You were a member of the creative team. My technical title was something of talent relations because they really didn't have a creative team title. You're one of the guys that goes to Vince's house and helps him write the show. There was no titles. And I was as important as he was. And he was as important. I can't say those words. He was on the same equal status in everybody's eyes as far as a member of the creative team as I was, because nobody had any position over anyone except Vince. And then later on, when they gave him his stooge and his suck up and his butt buddy and his paper carrier, Ed Ferrara, then I guess to placate him, they gave him a title of head writer. But that was not the case in those days. There was no title of that. So he misrepresented himself there. And anyway, he's tried to claim to deflect the fact that I hate him because of his obnoxious attitude toward wrestling. He's tried to claim that he got me fired and cost me money, but no, it didn't cost me any money. And the only thing he got me fired off of was something that I was miserable to be on to begin with. It is the way that he approached wrestling and the way that he approached the people in wrestling and the lack of respect of same and the whole fucking shit show that he implemented that made me despise him, whether he wants to believe it or not. Down deep, he knows it's true. And what was said on that program as well, when he said, it's freaking wrestling, it means nothing. That's exactly why my crusade against him will continue for so long. So I just wanted to clear those things up.
He didn't get you fired or cost you money in the WWE. Now, TNA, that's another story. Because Vince was much easier Vince was much harder to manipulate than old Darlin' Dixie. And yeah, he took the opportunity to get me out, Dutch out, Savio Vega, everybody out. And then they brought Hogan and Bischoff in and fucked him the very next month. But no, he definitely went behind all our backs. The email documentation has been there. The proof has been there. He stabbed everybody in the back in TNA. But once again, I've lost jobs that I was more fond of than the one in TNA at that point in time, especially with no Dutch and no Jeff to keep me from strangling this fucking guy. So then that wasn't that large an amount of money that we're talking about anyway, but it was the principle of the thing.
Just because when you tried to fuck me and didn't fuck me as good as you wanted to fuck me doesn't mean that I still shouldn't be mad at you for you fucking me.
Is it easier or harder to be principled in wrestling now versus then?
Oh God, it's much easier now because nobody wants to offend anybody and everybody wants to make sure everybody's happy. Before, I always wanted to err on the side of safety and do everything I can, for other people within reason. But there was free reign to just fuck people around back then as often as you wanted to in a lot of cases. But then we got corporate. Right. And there you have it.
Not a Montreal screw job, but someone else may have been doing some screw jobs to get people off the writing team.
Oh yeah, well, you go back and not just that, but with Bret. After you've already double-crossed him, and you're going to fucking stooge on him to the boss for saying that what everybody already knew anyway, that he would want Owen to come with him, but just to get brownie points. Vance fans, it's like telling a teacher with this guy. It's like fucking, he's got to be the narc. He's got to be the hall monitor to get the brownie points so that you can see how great he is and reward him with, letting him have everything his way until, you go out of business. He's always been that way. Everybody he's worked with, or everybody is. Here's the thing: not everybody has bad shit to say about him, but everybody that's really worked close with him in the same kind of level, not as like a writer talent, but as just as on the same level with him, has nothing good to say about him. And there's one more thing before I go. Writer. Here's another way that we're so far apart. You never had writers in wrestling. You had bookers. And being a booker was much more difficult than there's been some great writers, right? There's been Hemingway and Shakespeare and et cetera, and none of them have ever been in the wrestling business. Great bookers knew how to pick talent and how to match talent against each other that would bring the best out in each other, and how to juice up the rivalries and the confrontations with angles and little pieces of verbiage and things you could say and, stuff you could drop into conversation and little clues you could leave. And they knew how to manipulate the fans' emotions and what they would want to see in a particular territory, because some were more different than others, what they would want to see to keep them coming back week after week. And don't hot shot too much and don't kill your baby face. He's got to be in jeopardy, and he's got to be in danger. And he's got to lose more than he wins, but he always has to win the blow off. But don't keep the blow off too long, or they'll lose faith in him. Or, get heat on your heel, but not too much heat where it's disgusting heat. The intricacies, and keep your roster happy, and make sure they make enough money, but that they won't leave, but not enough money that they get independent. And always make sure that the promoter is happy with, and all the other intricacies of being a promoter and why that was an art in wrestling. And he said at one time, Booker Schmooker, I'm a writer. Yeah, that's why you shouldn't have been anywhere near a fucking locker room, you fucking dickless twat. He wanted to be a writer because he thought that's what you needed to be in the wrestling business, because his limited cognitive ability and simpleton's understanding of what he had been watching on TV but had never been involved in, that's as far as he could get with it. To understand it was, I'll just be the writer and tell all these guys what to do. I always wanted to be a booker. I never wanted to be a writer. Writers shouldn't be involved in fucking wrestling. I've said that a million times. He never wanted to be a booker because he didn't understand what a booker was. He thought a booker was wrestling. I'm a writer. One day maybe he's going to win an Emmy. But he's the only writer I've ever known who claimed to be a goddamn big-time fucking college journalism fucking major. He's from New York City, and he went to fucking journalism school in Evansville, Indiana, if that tells you anything. And then still couldn't fucking spell when he got out of that fucking program. So the difference was. He wanted to be a writer. And he did about as well as a writer does in wrestling, which is shit the bed, because it's not a person that understands what they're supposed to be doing. He never wanted to be a booker because he wasn't smart enough to understand that was even what he wanted to be. But he wasn't good enough to be that anyway. So that terminology, we should clear that up as well. Everybody from New York, Brian, that has promise in the literary world and wants to be a journalist or a writer, they go to school in southern Indiana, don't they?
That's usually the road to getting a book published, is you go to Evansville.
All right. Anyway, So just a few things that we wanted to all clear up there before we signed off. Next week, we have no idea what we're doing.